The horror began quietly. A gentle clink of metal, a polite cough behind a surgeon's mask, and then, under the pale haze of gaslight, a thin steel instrument slid toward a patient's eye, as if it were nothing more than a routine adjustment of spectacles. Victorian physicians called it progress, a miracle even, this new operation of the mind. But those who stood close enough to smell the ether, to hear the faint crack of bone beneath the tap of a hammer, knew that something far more dreadful was unfolding. A cure that did not heal, only hollowed. In the asylums of London, where corridors echoed with restrained sobs and whispered prayers, families handed their loved ones over with trembling optimism. Doctors promised serenity, obedience, relief from violent fits. Instead, the moment the instrument slipped behind the eye socket, consciousness loosened like a candle snuffed in a draught, leaving behind a body that breathed, blinked, and yet was somehow emptied. A living silence. Stay with me before the lamps grow dimmer and the truth slips back into the fog. And as you listen, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Your city, your country, your place in the world becomes another lantern in this dark history we share. If you're ready to descend into the rooms where Victorian medicine dared to trespass upon the soul itself, like and subscribe so you never miss the next step into the shadows. Because what came next was not science, it was sacrifice. The instrument lay upon a linen cloth as though it were an heirloom rather than a threat, its polished steel catching the gaslight in a sharp, unwavering line. In the hush of the surgical suite, where the walls were tiled in a somber cream and the air breathed faintly of carbolic acid, the tool seemed almost beautiful, elegant, deceptively harmless. Yet every man in the room understood that once it crossed the threshold of bone, something unspoken would be lost forever. Madness, they called it, chaos, disturbance of the mind. But the instrument itself did not discriminate. It carved through suffering and memory with equal indifference. Dr. Theodore Whitcomb stood over it with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. His spectacles reflected two perfect crescents of lamplight, obscuring his eyes in a way that made his face appear mask-like, emotionless, unreadable, as if he had long since surrendered his conscience to science. Around him, the small team of assistants waited with hands folded neatly behind their backs. They behaved not as men, about to witness a terrifying experiment, but as clerks observing the final entries of a ledger. Calm, dutiful, obedient. On the table lay the patient, a middle-aged man whose hair still bore the scent of soap from the preliminary washing. His wrists were secured with soft restraints, the kind favored by progressive asylums that wished to appear humane. Beneath the ether cone, his breaths came in slow, quivering pulls, each exhalation fogging the interior of the mask. The faint sweetness of the fumes drifted through the room like perfumed mist, softening edges, blurring conscience. Dr. Whitcomb adjusted his gloves. The rubber snapped faintly against his cuffs, an unremarkable sound, yet in that moment it carried the weight of a verdict. He leaned toward the patient, listening to the slow hum of unconsciousness, then straightened with a quiet sigh. A simple intervention, he murmured, more to himself than to the staff. A liberation of the distressed mind. No one corrected him. No one dared. He lifted the shining instrument, its slender shaft narrowing toward a tapered point, designed with unnerving precision. It had been modeled after the latest neurological theories, ideas that spoke confidently of emotional centers, psychic knots, and misfiring impulses. The instrument promised to dislodge these invisible maladies, to still the storms that tore patients from themselves. That it also stilled the very essence of who they were was a detail whispered only in private, if at all. He made the first incision at the corner of the man's eye, just a delicate slit, merely enough to admit the instrument. A bead of blood rose like a ruby beneath the gaslight. The assistants did not flinch. They leaned closer, notebooks poised, fascinated by the emergence of a new frontier. Then came the tap. A single, polite stroke of the surgeon's small mallet, gentle enough to seem almost affectionate, yet unmistakably final. A muted crack resounded from beneath the skin, the fragile orbital plate giving way like thin porcelain. In that instant, the patient's breath hitched a small, involuntary tremor and then settled again into the rhythmic pull of ethered sleep. Dr. Whitcomb's expression softened with triumph. "There," he whispered, "the mind begins to yield." Outside, fog pressed against the windows, as though London itself were holding its breath. Inside, the surgeon guided the instrument deeper, severing unseen threads that bound thought to memory, memory to personality, personality to the soul. Each quiet motion drew the patient farther from who he had been mere minutes before, and as Dr. Whitcomb withdrew the tool, its metal now touched with blood and something more abstract, something no cloth could truly wipe away. The room remained impossibly calm. The assistants recorded observations. The lamps hummed. The patient lay silent, serene, unknowable. The instrument gleamed again as it was placed back upon the cloth. And in that gleam lived the birth of a new Victorian promise, that madness could be cured with a cut, and humanity could be reshaped with a tap. The corridors of the asylum were built for silence. Thick brick walls muffled the cries that once echoed freely through older institutions, and double doors, heavily panelled, meticulously oiled, closed with a softness that felt almost conspiratorial. It was behind these doors, in the dim warmth of the medical boardroom, that the surgeons gathered to discuss their remarkable new intervention. No proclamations to the public, no lectures to universities, only quiet, deliberate conferences, held in rooms where the windows were drawn and the fog outside could not listen. A decanter of sherry sat upon the central table, its contents glowing like liquid amber beneath the gas lamps. Beside it lay a stack of freshly printed pamphlets, clinical diagrams, calm assurances, elegant descriptions of neurocorrective precision. The language was gentle, refined, intentionally bloodless. And yet, the men seated around the table spoke in tones laced with the thrill of danger, usually reserved for explorers describing uncharted lands. Dr. Whitcomb presided, his hands, still bearing faint discolorations from the previous operation's gloves, folded neatly atop one another as he surveyed his colleagues. "The results are promising," he said, his voice smooth as lacquer. "The reduction in agitation is immediate. The mind, once unruly, becomes quiet enough to manage. The families will be grateful." A ripple of murmured assent passed around the room. Gratitude was a useful word, comforting, socially palatable. No one mentioned the hollow, faraway stare they had all seen in the patient after the operation, the way his lips tried to form a memory that never emerged, the way his fingers moved as though searching for something already lost. Dr. Herrick, a younger physician whose ambition outpaced his caution, leaned forward eagerly. "If this is indeed the beginning of a curative age, we must establish protocols, demonstrations, perhaps even a published case series. London could become the world's seat of neurological refinement." Dr. Ashby, older and more cautious, cleared his throat. His spectacles rested low upon his nose, giving him the appearance of a man forever on the verge of descent. "Refinement is one word," he said softly. "Irreversibility is another. We tread in regions of the mind we scarcely understand." Whitcomb's smile did not falter. All progress demands a measure of boldness. "Besides," he added, lifting his teacup, "these patients are in torment. Are we not obligated to relieve them?" No one wished to appear uncharitable, and so Ashby's protest dissolved beneath the weight of professional pride and the increasingly intoxicating notion that they were pioneers of the unseen. A nurse entered briefly to stoke the fire. She moved quietly, head bowed, her eyes flicking only once toward the physicians. She had seen what the procedure produced in its aftermath, patients sitting upright yet vacant, as if their souls had been gently excised while their bodies remained dutifully alive. But she held her silence. Hers was not a profession afforded the luxury of questioning. When the door closed behind her, the discussions resumed with renewed fervor. Whitcomb unrolled a diagram depicting the frontal lobes. "Observe," he said, tapping the parchment lightly. "If the disorder originates here, this cluster, this troublesome seat of emotion, then a severing of its pathways naturally calms the storm." Ashby exhaled slowly through his nose. "But at what cost? We simplify what we cannot restore." Herrick countered him briskly. "Will posterity thank us for hesitating while patients tear their hair and scream into the night? The world demands cures, not caution." The debate hung in the air like the residue of ether, sweet, persuasive, corrupting. A knock interrupted them. A matron stepped inside with a sealed envelope. "A request from the family of Miss Eleanor Grace," she said. "They ask whether Dr. Whitcomb might consider her a candidate for the new treatment." Whitcomb accepted the letter with a practiced solemnity, though his eyes gleamed faintly. The first private request. The first voluntary submission to the procedure. "Very well," he murmured. "Schedule a consultation." The matron hesitated, then departed, leaving a faint shiver in her wake. The surgeons exchanged looks, some triumphant, some uneasy. The room seemed to narrow, the air thickening with the sensation that they had crossed an invisible threshold. Outside, the fog tightened around the asylum like a waiting shroud. Behind closed doors, the whispers grew bolder, and a cure that had never been tested by sunlight continued its quiet march into the minds of London's most vulnerable. The morning Miss Eleanor Grace arrived at the asylum, a pale winter light filtered through the wrought-iron gates, catching in the frost that clung to her travelling cloak. She stood as though uncertain whether the stone steps before her led into a hospital or a tomb. Her hands, gloved in soft dove-grey leather, trembled with such fine, persistent motion that even the footman who escorted her looked away, as if witnessing a private unravelling he had no right to see. Inside, the entrance hall greeted her with its characteristic mix of antiseptic soap, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of lingering ether. The tiles were spotless, the decor dignified, every brass fixture polished to a quiet gleam. To the untrained eye, it was a place of promise. But Eleanor felt the walls tilt inward, as though the building itself had been waiting for her. Her father, a stern gentleman of banking distinction, guided her forward with the firm, yet embarrassed grip of a man who believed his daughter had become an inconvenience to her social milieu. Her mother trailed behind, clutching a lace handkerchief already damp at its corners. Eleanor's trembling intensified as they approached Dr. Whitcomb's consultation room. Dr. Whitcomb greeted them with an expression too serene to be comforting. He motioned gracefully toward the upholstered chair opposite his desk. "Miss Grace," he said, folding his hands with practiced gentleness, "it is an honor to meet you." Her voice wavered. "I do not wish to stay here." The words fell softly, but the tremor in her hands spoke louder. Hands that had once sketched fashions with enviable talent, hands that now betrayed her without mercy. Her father gave a clipped sigh, his jaw tightening as if to prevent any display of sympathy. Whitcomb leaned forward. "My dear, we seek not to confine you, but to liberate you from the torment that grips those hands. The tremors, you see, are merely the surface of a deeper agitation. And we believe," here he paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle, "that we may offer relief." Eleanor swallowed. "By cutting into my mind?" Her mother stifled a gasp. Whitcomb smiled as though soothing a nervous child. "Not cutting," Miss Grace refining, "quieting the pathways that overwhelm your thoughts. You shall not lose yourself. You shall simply be freed from the storm." But Eleanor saw in the faint reflection of her own face on the polished metal instruments arranged behind him, something that unsettled her more deeply than her trembling. Those tools gleamed with a kind of cold ambition. They looked hungry. A soft knock preceded the entry of Nurse Dawes, who carried a tray of tea. She set it down carefully, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. She had witnessed enough post-operation patients to recognize the early signs of dread, but like all staff beneath the doctor's authority, she remained silent. Whitcomb poured tea for the family as though presiding over an afternoon visit, not a prelude to a life-altering intervention. "Miss Grace," he continued, "your case is ideal. You exhibit distress without the violence seen in more desperate patients. We can intervene before your condition worsens, before the tremors rule your life entirely." Her father nodded vigorously. "We cannot endure another public scene," he muttered, as though her suffering were an inconvenience rather than a plea for help. Eleanor felt the room dim. Her breath quickened. Her hands, trembling violently now, clutched the fabric of her skirt until the seam stretched. "I want to go home," she whispered. Whitcomb rose, his posture full of quiet assurance. This is the path home. A mind restored, a life returned to order. Outside the frosted window, a winter gust pressed against the glass, rattling it softly like a warning no one inside could hear. And as the papers were signed, as formalities concluded, and polite smiles masked irreversible decisions, Eleanor Grace realized something with chilling clarity. This place did not treat trembling hands. It harvested them. By evening, she would be prepared for the procedure. By morning, she would be changed in ways no one present dared to imagine. The operating room had been prepared hours before Miss Eleanor Grace was led inside. Its polished tile floor reflected the wavering glow of the gas lamps overhead, giving the illusion of standing above a shallow pool of yellow light. Every surface had been scrubbed with obsessive precision. The copper basins gleamed, the instruments lay in orderly rows upon fresh linen, and the chill of the morning air still clung to the walls like a silent witness. Yet despite all this cleanliness, the room carried a scent no amount of scrubbing could erase, the cloying sweetness of ether, thick enough to make the air feel heavy with unspoken sorrow. Nurse Dawes entered first, her shoes tapping softly against the tile. She made no attempt to hide the tremor in her breath as she positioned the padded restraints along the surgical table. She had done this dozens of times, yet something about Miss Grace's approaching footsteps caused a faint ache to stir in her chest. Perhaps it was the girl's youth, perhaps the quiet dignity she carried, even in distress, or perhaps it was the memory of all the vacant-eyed patients she had seen afterward, those who returned from the procedure with their suffering quieted. Yes, but their brightness dimmed like candles left too long in the cold. A moment later, Eleanor appeared in the doorway escorted by 2 attendants. Her trembling hands were clasped tightly before her, as though she feared they might betray her further by attempting escape. She wore a simple white gown tied at the waist, its fabric too thin for the winter air. The color made her seem ghost-like, an unfinished sketch, awaiting its final, irrevocable stroke. Dr. Whitcomb followed close behind, his demeanor composed, his posture one of serene purpose. The gleam of his spectacles reflected the instruments laid out before him, granting his face an almost mechanical aspect. "Miss Grace," he said gently, "I assure you this shall be over quickly. You will wake with a calmer mind, a steadier hand, a restored peace." Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the metal tools, 2 slender probes, a small mallet, and a delicate bone separator. They were innocuous objects in the abstract, yet together they formed the architecture of her fate. Her breath quickened. "Please," she murmured, her voice barely stirring the air. "I feel better today. I believe I can manage." Her father, who had insisted upon accompanying her to the threshold, stiffened. "Eleanor," he said sharply, "do not make a spectacle. This is for your own good." The attendants guided her to the table. Nurse Dawes assisted with unexpected tenderness, adjusting the pillow, straightening the sheet, brushing a loose curl from Eleanor's cheek. For a fleeting moment, compassion flickered between them, an acknowledgement that one woman's fate depended entirely on another's silence. The ether cone was placed over Eleanor's nose and mouth. The pungent sweetness filled her throat first, then her lungs, then her thoughts. Her limbs grew leaden. The trembling slowed. The room blurred into soft, indistinct shapes. She fought to keep her eyes open long enough to see a familiar face, but instead she found only the ceiling cold, indifferent, waiting. As consciousness slipped, one final tear slid from the corner of her eye. It sparkled briefly in the lamplight before disappearing into the linen beneath her. Dr. Whitcomb nodded to his assistants. "We may begin." The instruments sang their metallic chorus as they were lifted from the cloth. The mallet's first gentle tap echoed faintly through the chamber, a disarmingly courteous sound, like someone knocking upon a door that would never again be opened. The scent of ether deepened, mingling with the sharp tang of exposed bone. Nurse Dawes closed her eyes for a moment, not to pray, for she had long abandoned the notion of divine intervention within these walls, but to preserve the last memory she had of Miss Eleanor Grace before the operation rendered her someone else entirely. When she opened them, the procedure was already underway, and the air around her, heavy with sweetness and regret, felt like the breath of the room itself, mourning what could not be undone. The room seemed to exhale as Dr. Whitcomb positioned the slender instrument at the fragile seam of bone just above Miss Eleanor Grace's eye. The gas lamps flickered almost nervously, casting wavering halos across the tiled walls, as though the light itself recoiled from what was about to be done. For a suspended moment, nothing moved. Even the air felt still, thickened by ether and the quiet dread of those who stood too close to witness the reshaping of a human mind. Whitcomb raised the small surgical mallet with the poise of a man about to initiate a delicate ritual. His gloved fingers curled around its handle with a practiced familiarity that bordered on affection. "Steady," he murmured, though whether to himself or to the unconscious young woman before him, no one could tell. The assistants leaned forward, breath held. Nurse Dawes stood at the patient's side, one hand lightly resting upon Eleanor's arm, not as restraint, but as a final gesture of the humanity soon to be eclipsed. Then it came. A single tap, soft, measured, almost tender. The sound was no louder than the crack of a teacup set upon fine porcelain, yet its effect rippled through the room like a shudder. The fragile orbital bone yielded beneath the blow with a muted, sickening snap. The instrument slipped past the broken shell into the dark interior of the skull, disappearing into the labyrinth that housed memory, fear, longing, joy, all the things that made Miss Eleanor Grace who she was. Her body twitched faintly under the ether's spell. A small sigh escaped her lips, so delicate it could have been mistaken for a dream. But nothing about the moment was gentle, no matter how softly the mallet had fallen. Whitcomb's expression remained serene. He guided the instrument with slow, sweeping motions, severing the invisible threads that bound thought to emotion. "The agitation resides here," he said quietly, shifting the tool. "A disordered current. Once interrupted, the storm will cease." The storm he spoke of was not visible, yet those gathered could sense it, the subtle unraveling of something sacred, the quiet dying of an inner spark. The air felt colder, though no window stood open. Nurse Dawes felt the change most keenly. She had held hands of the afflicted, the grieving, the violent, the desolate. She had seen despair, rage, delirium. But nothing unnerved her like the stillness settling over Miss Grace. This stillness was not peace, it was absence. Whitcomb withdrew the instrument with a gentle slide. A streak of diluted blood clung to its metal surface, glistening under the lamps. He wiped it clean with a linen cloth as though erasing a minor blemish from an otherwise flawless performance. "Successful," he pronounced, stepping back with the calm conviction of a man who believed he stood at the vanguard of human progress. An assistant nodded eagerly as he recorded the observation. Patient showed minimal resistance, no complications. But Nurse Dawes did not celebrate. She glanced at Eleanor's face, its softness unchanged, yet subtly altered, as if some quiet radiance had been extinguished. The tremor in her hands was gone. They lay relaxed upon the table, fingers slightly curled like petals of a flower after nightfall. But the serenity felt unnatural, borrowed, imposed. A silence expanded through the room, not the tranquil silence of relief, nor the respectful quiet of solemn work. This was a hollow, echoing silence, the kind that follows something breaking. Whitcomb motioned for the attendants to prepare the patient for recovery. "In time," he said, removing his gloves, "she will thank us. Her suffering is over." Nurse Dawes looked again at the still, pale face before her and felt a prickle at the back of her neck. Yes, she thought, her suffering is over. But so too, perhaps, is something far more precious. With that single gentle tap, a world had broken quietly, politely, irreversibly. The carriage wheels crackled over the frosted stones as Mr. and Mrs. Grace arrived the next morning to collect their daughter. Pale sunlight filtered weakly through the London fog, casting long, wavering shadows across the asylum courtyard. It was the kind of morning that held its breath too still, too expectant, as though the city itself sensed that something unnatural had taken place behind the quiet brick walls. Mrs. Grace stepped out first, her gloved hands clutching her shawl against the cold. She had not slept. The red rims of her eyes betrayed a night spent in restless worry, though she kept her posture rigid, her chin high. Her husband followed with brisk assurance, already rehearsing the polite gratitude he intended to express to the doctors who had restored his daughter. Inside, the corridors were warm and faintly sweet with the ever-present scent of ether. Gas lamps hummed above their heads, orderlies moved with silent purpose. Nothing outwardly alarming interrupted the routine hum of the hospital, yet an almost imperceptible tension clung to the air, as though the walls themselves wished to speak, but dared not. They were shown to a small receiving room, furnished with 2 stiff-backed chairs and a mahogany table upon which sat a single vase containing a wilting rose. Mrs. Grace's gaze lingered on the flower, its petals curled inward like fingers withdrawing from touch. Moments later, Dr. Whitcomb entered, his expression composed, his hands clasped in a gesture of serene triumph. "Mr. and Mrs. Grace," he greeted warmly, "I am pleased to report that the procedure was a success. Your daughter is resting now, calmer than we have ever observed her." Mrs. Grace exhaled a fragile breath of relief. "May we see her?" "Of course," he said, offering a courtly nod. "But I would urge you to remain gentle in your expectations. Recovery requires quiet, patience, and a willingness to see improvement where it may appear subtle." The warning lingered oddly in the air, but Mr. Grace dismissed it with a brisk wave of his hand. "We understand. We are grateful for your skill, Doctor." Whitcomb's smile did not quite reach his eyes. They followed him through a series of narrow hallways until they reached a softly lit room where Eleanor lay propped against white pillows. Her hair had been brushed neatly, and her gown freshened, giving her an almost serene beauty. Her hands, those once trembling, delicate hands, rested motionless upon her lap. Mrs. Grace rushed to her daughter's side. "Eleanor, my darling," her voice faltered. "How do you feel?" Eleanor turned her head slowly, too slowly. Her eyes, once sharp with creative spark and restless intelligence, drifted toward her mother with a distant softness that did not quite resemble recognition. She blinked once, then again. Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for a word that had slipped away before reaching her tongue. "I feel quiet," she whispered. Not relieved, not healed, quiet. Mrs. Grace clutched her daughter's hand and froze. The warmth was there, but not the pressure of returned affection. Eleanor's fingers did not curl around her mother's. They merely lay still, obedient, indifferent. Mr. Grace seemed not to notice or refuse to. "The trembling is gone," he observed triumphantly. "A remarkable improvement." Eleanor's gaze drifted toward him with the same distant calm, her expression unchanged. There was no joy in her face, no sorrow either, only a muted stillness, like a lamp turned low but not extinguished. Whitcomb folded his hands behind his back. Her agitation has been relieved. Her mind is no longer burdened by the storms that plagued her. With time, she may regain certain habits of expression. Mrs. Grace's throat tightened. May regain? Whitcomb offered a placid smile, a smile that masked the uncertainty, the regrets, the unspoken truths. Healing takes time. But Nurse Dawes, standing silently in the corner, saw what the Graces did not yet understand. She had witnessed this same hollow serenity in dozens of others. This was not healing, it was erasure. Eleanor looked past her parents toward the window, where a thin strand of winter sunlight filtered through. She did not flinch at its brightness. She did not smile. She merely watched, as though observing a world that no longer held meaning. Mr. Grace straightened proudly, unaware of the depth of what had been altered. "You see?" he whispered to his wife. "The doctor was right. Our Eleanor is finally at peace." Mrs. Grace nodded shakily, tears gathering not from relief but from an instinctive, unspoken dread she could not yet name. Behind them, Nurse Dawes lowered her eyes. For she alone knew the truth. Peace was not what had been given, only silence. A silence no earthly remedy could reverse. The days following Miss Eleanor Grace's operation passed with an eerie smoothness, as though time itself had been lulled into a soft, unbroken hush. The nurses remarked upon it first how the familiar clamour of the women's ward seemed to soften whenever she entered, not because she demanded attention, nor because she contributed to the fray, but because she carried with her a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if she moved within a bubble of air untouched by the world's ordinary noise. She walked the corridors slowly, her slippered feet making faint whispers along the polished floors. Her hands, once alive with nervous tremors, hung passively at her sides. Her face, pale as candle wax and unlined by emotion, revealed nothing of her inner state. There were no signs of fear, no flickers of despair, but neither were there the small sparks of curiosity or delight that once colored her features. Her mind had quieted, yes, but in a manner so absolute it unsettled all who observed her. Nurse Dawes watched her most closely. She had attended Eleanor's recovery, adjusting her pillows, coaxing her to take broth she no longer tasted, guiding her through exchanges she no longer initiated. At first, Nurse Dawes tried to tell herself this was temporary, an after-effect of surgery, a passing fog that would lift. But fog did not sit so evenly upon a person. Fog shifted, thickened, thinned. This stillness did not waver. It clung. On the third morning, Dawes brought Eleanor to the common room where patients read, embroidered, or stared absently into the fire. Eleanor was led to a cushioned chair near the window, one she had once chosen for the good light it offered her sketches. She sat obediently, hands folded neatly in her lap. The window framed a winter garden, brittle hedges, a dusting of frost, a single blackbird hopping along the path. Eleanor looked toward it but not at it. Her gaze hovered somewhere just beyond, as though the world were a painting hung slightly crooked on a distant wall. "Miss Grace," Nurse Dawes said softly, kneeling beside her. "Shall I bring your sketchbook?" Eleanor blinked. A long, slow blink. "Sketch. Book," she repeated, tasting the word the way one might test a foreign language. Her eyes did not brighten with recognition. She did not reach for it. She merely repeated the syllables with vacant politeness, then let them dissolve into silence. Her mother visited that afternoon, arriving with hope stitched into every line of her trembling smile. She carried a box of Eleanor's belongings, small comforts from home, tokens to stir familiarity. A silk ribbon, a scented handkerchief, a miniature portrait painted by Eleanor herself. "My darling," Mrs. Grace whispered, embracing her daughter. "I've brought your things. Your favorite scarf, do you remember?" Eleanor held the scarf delicately, smoothing it between her fingers, as though feeling it through a layer of glass. "Soft," she said. It was the only word she offered. Mrs. Grace pressed the miniature portrait into her daughter's palm. "You painted this," she said, voice quivering. "You were so proud of it." Eleanor studied the tiny painting, the careful brushstrokes, the luminous eyes, the rosy mouth of the sitter, and furrowed her brow in a faint, puzzled way. "Pretty," she murmured. "Who is she?" Mrs. Grace's heart gave a sharp, painful twist. Tears gathered, but she forced herself to smile. "Just someone you once knew, my love. Someone dear." Dr. Whitcomb arrived soon after, his expression serene, his tone laden with gentle satisfaction. "Miss Grace continues to show signs of improvement," he observed. "Her agitation has ceased entirely. Her mind is calm." Calm. That word echoed through the room like an accusation. Nurse Dawes noticed something else, the way Eleanor's gaze, once easily anchored by faces and voices, drifted now like a slow current beneath still water. She responded to questions, but only after a beat too long, as though searching for instructions rather than memories. She laughed at nothing. She cried at nothing. She dreamed, if she dreamed at all, without movement or sound. Her father arrived the next day, praising the transformation. "At last," he said proudly. "She is manageable, peaceful." But the staff who watched her daily saw the truth with growing dread. This was not peace. This was vacancy, a quiet, so profound it no longer belonged to life. Eleanor Grace had been cured of her trembling. But in its place, the surgeons had cultivated something far more devastating. A mind reduced to quiet, and a soul muted beyond recognition. Superintendent Horatio Bellwether strode through the asylum with the air of a man who believed himself the architect of a medical revolution. His polished boots clicked smartly along the corridor, announcing his presence even before his silver watch chain and faint musk of pipe tobacco betrayed him. Though the building around him was heavy with the scent of ether, fading disinfectant, and the muffled ache of troubled minds, Bellwether walked as if moving through the marbled halls of Parliament rather than an institution built upon the misery of the forgotten. He paused at each ward he passed, peering through narrow glass panes set into reinforced doors. Patients sat in orderly rows, some murmuring to themselves, others rocking gently, still others staring blankly into the horizon of their own minds. But among them, one figure drew his attention more than the rest. Miss Eleanor Grace, stationed neatly in her window chair, her hands perfectly still, her posture immaculate, her expression empty but docile. A triumph, he thought. A proper triumph. Bellwether entered the common room with a flourish, his cane tapping against the tile with theatrical rhythm. Nurses straightened instinctively, orderlies bowed their heads. Even the flickering lamps seemed to brighten in his presence, reflecting the shine of his self-satisfaction. "Ah," he announced, hands clasped behind his back. "There she is, our newest testament to progress." Miss Grace turned her head at the sound of his voice, not quickly, not with recognition, but with the slow, mechanical glide of a clock pendulum completing its swing. Her eyes met his only briefly before drifting away again, as though unable to decide whether he existed at all. Bellwether smiled broadly. "Notice the serenity," he told Nurse Dawes, who stood dutifully at Eleanor's side. Not a trace of the nervous disorder described in her charts. Her tremors have ceased, her affect is calm, the procedure has delivered precisely what we promised. Nurse Dawes swallowed, fighting the urge to protest. Her hands were clasped so tightly behind her back that her knuckles whitened. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "She is quiet." "Quiet," Bellwether echoed, savouring the word. "A blessed state in a place such as this." He strode around Eleanor's chair, inspecting her as one might inspect a finely crafted clock or a new piece of machinery. "Imagine, Dawes," he mused, "what this means for the future of mental care. No more uncontrollable fits, no more violent outbursts, no more complaints from families about the cost of prolonged treatment. We can give society compliant citizens once more order restored with but a tap of a surgeon's hand." Dawes lifted her chin slightly. "And what of the minds behind that quiet, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bellwether paused, his expression cooled. "Their minds," he said slowly, "are troubled places. If a small adjustment spares them torment, who are we to question the method?" The nurse said nothing more. She knew from experience that moral inquiries slid off the superintendent like water off glass. Bellwether resumed his circuit, tapping his cane thoughtfully. "We shall prepare a report," he declared. "A paper for the Medical Gazette. The public must know of our success. London is ripe for reassurance. Parents, husbands, employers, all desperate for an answer to the growing afflictions of modern life. And we," he added with a flourish, "shall offer them one." He gestured toward Eleanor with the air of unveiling a prized sculpture. "Picture it, the Grace case, a shining example of what refined intervention may achieve. Her transformation will become the model for countless others." Nurse Dawes's stomach twisted. She saw Eleanor's vacant gaze, her slackened hands, her delicate stillness that spoke not of healing but of absence. Yet Bellwether saw only success. And in this place, success was measured not in restored humanity, but in obedience, silence, and cost efficiency. A visiting board member happened to pass by, his coat collar dusted with frost. Bellwether intercepted him eagerly. "Come, come," he urged. "You must see the results of our latest procedure. Remarkable work. Revolutionary." The board member peered at Eleanor, nodding with mild approval. "She seems well-behaved." "Precisely," Bellwether said, triumphant. "An ideal outcome." The men walked on, discussing funding, publicity, and the future empire of corrective neurology they intended to build. Behind them, Eleanor Grace blinked slowly at the winter garden beyond the window, her breath steady, her hands still, her mind unreachable. Nurse Dawes lowered her gaze, knowing that in the eyes of those in charge, a stolen soul was merely a side effect, a necessary cost, a forgotten whisper beneath the rising roar of Victorian progress. Dr. Alistair Herrick had once prided himself on being a rational man. He rose early, read the medical journals delivered to his step each morning, and maintained a steady hand through even the most delicate procedures. But increasingly, as winter's breath pressed cold fingers against his narrow townhouse windows, sleep eluded him. His dreams, when they came at all, were fractured things, stitched together from fragments of bone, gentle taps of mallets, and the vacant eyes of the patients he had helped. On this particular night, the fire in his study burned low, casting long shadows across the shelves, where monographs on neurology and cerebral anatomy sat in perfect, disciplined order. Their gold-lettered spines gleamed faintly, as though mocking him with promises of certainty. Herrick leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The scent of ether seemed to cling to him even here, far from the asylum, a ghostly sweetness embedded in the fabric of his coat. He told himself he was imagining it, but the mind has a way of replaying what the conscience tries to bury. He saw Miss Eleanor Grace's face each time he closed his eyes. Not the face from before, drawn with suffering and tremors, but the one she wore now, still, smooth, emptied of spirit. A mask masquerading as serenity. It was not supposed to be like this. Herrick rose abruptly, pacing before the dying fire. His footsteps were soft on the carpet, but inside his skull another rhythm beat louder, the echo of Dr. Whitcomb's mallet as it broke through the delicate orbital plate. No matter how gently struck, no matter how refined the motion, the sound had a way of reverberating long after the procedure ended, a sound too final to forget. He paused at the mantel, staring into the mirror above it. The reflection that met him was not the one he recognized from earlier years. The eyes were different, darker, ringed with sleeplessness, clouded with doubt. He had once imagined himself a savior of minds, a surgeon at the forefront of enlightenment. Now, standing alone in the dim room, he felt like an intruder in the sanctity of the human soul. His thoughts drifted back to the surgical theatre. The moment after Whitcomb had withdrawn the instrument, the way Eleanor had lain there breathing, alive, yet somehow diminished. The nurses had looked at one another with quiet dread. Even Whitcomb had paused for the briefest second, something unreadable flickering across his expression. But then he smiled and declared the procedure a success. Herrick felt his stomach twist. He returned to his chair, sinking heavily into it as though the weight of his doubts were suddenly tangible. The fire crackled weakly, shadows stretching across his floor like grasping fingers. He rubbed his temples, attempting to soothe the throbbing tension that pulsed behind his eyes. Was this truly progress? Was this the cost of order? He opened a case file from the pile beside him. It was not Eleanor's, but another patient, a young man named Jacob Merton, 22 years old, committed for melancholia and unproductive habits. Herrick read the post-operation notes. Agitation, eliminated. Speech minimal. Emotional response, negligible. Compliant. Compliant, a word that once comforted him now felt sinister. He closed the file slowly, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile within. The clock chimed softly on the mantel. Midnight. Outside, fog rolled along the street, swallowing lamplight and muffling the world into a hush. Herrick stared into the fire until its last embers dimmed, the room sinking into darkness. He knew morning would bring another consultation, another hopeful family, another trembling patient awaiting reassurance. And he knew, with growing dread, that he could not keep offering promises he no longer believed. For the first time since joining Whitcomb's team, Dr. Herrick was afraid, not of madness, but of the quiet they were manufacturing in its place. London in the winter months carried an unease that crept through its fog-laced streets like a restless spirit. Smoke poured from chimneys in thick grey ribbons, mingling with the ever-present coal dust until the very air seemed to hum with tension. Horses clattered over cobblestones slick with frost. Gas lamps flickered beneath the burden of dampness, and the Thames, swollen from rain, rolled past the embankments with a sluggish determination. Beneath this atmospheric weight, the city's nerves were frayed. Factories shrieked through the night. Crowds pressed tightly in public houses, seeking escape in ale and noise. The West End glittered, yes, but even there, behind heavy drapes and lace-curtained windows, anxieties simmered. Children struggled with unexplained fits. Wives succumbed to melancholia. Sons returned from school with restless hands and sleepless eyes. Men, once considered bastions of rationality, collapsed under invisible burdens. Madness, so London believed, was spreading. It arrived quietly, not with plague carts or church bells tolling doom, but through little fractures. An outburst during supper, a public fainting, a neighbour muttering to himself on the street. Every household, it seemed, held a tremor beneath its polished surface. So, when whispers of Dr. Whitcomb's corrective operation drifted through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs, they did not meet horror. They met hunger. Newspapers, always eager for a sensation, printed cautious praise. A novel approach to mental agitation, promising results in cases previously deemed hopeless. A gentle procedure for the overwrought mind. The word Gentle appeared often, far too often. Evenings in parlours were soon filled with murmured conversations. "Have you heard? The daughter of that banking fellow returned home quiet as a lamb. They say the operation takes only minutes." Imagine peace restored without chains or rest cures. Perhaps my own niece might benefit. She's been so unpredictable. The elite loved nothing more than a solution wrapped in elegance, and Whitcomb supplied exactly that. His pamphlets, printed on cream paper, bordered with tasteful filigree, circulated like invitations to a private miracle. They spoke of disorderly neural pathways, of refined adjustments to restore harmony. They did not speak of the mallet. They did not speak of the moment bone gave way. They did not speak of the stillness that followed. Across the river, in poorer boroughs, the asylum carriages became more frequent. Families, exhausted by the strain of caring for the afflicted, saw the operation as a final mercy. Mothers wept but signed the forms anyway. Fathers hardened their hearts and convinced themselves it was for the best. What else could they do? A city drowning in noise longed desperately for quiet. One evening, the superintendent of Bethlehem Hospital, a man fond of grand pronouncements, declared publicly, "We are entering a new age of mental restoration, an age in which disorder shall yield to order, agitation to tranquility, and the suffering mind to civilized refinement." The audience applauded. No one asked what tranquility cost. Yet not everyone was blind to consequence. In dim coffee houses near Fleet Street, a few journalists muttered suspicions. A nurse from an outlying hospital spoke too candidly after one too many brandies, and her murmurs about hollow-eyed patients landed in the pages of a small, disregarded column. A clergyman preached uneasily about the sanctity of the soul, but such voices were faint, little more than the creaking of boards beneath the roaring machinery of public enthusiasm. For London, with its gaslit avenues and restless nights, was tired of madness, tired of unpredictability, tired of the fraying edges of its own progress. If peace could be purchased with a surgical fee and a polite signature, who would refuse? And so, while fog wrapped the city in its grey, muffling the cries of those altered beyond recognition, London welcomed the quiet with open arms, never suspecting that the quiet was not the cure at all, but the first warning of a storm hidden in silence. The leaflets appeared as quietly as frost upon a window pane. One morning, Londoners awoke to find them tucked beneath brass letter slots, slipped between the pages of newspapers, pinned politely upon notice boards in chemists' shops. Printed on thick cream paper with delicate blue filigree, they resembled invitations to a charitable concert or a genteel lecture, never the heralds of something far more sinister. Their elegance was deliberate. Every curve of lettering had been chosen to soothe. Across the top, in refined serif font, the heading read, "A new era in mental restoration. A gentle operation for overwrought minds." The words glowed with promise. Beneath the heading, an illustration depicted a serene figure reclining upon a cushioned chair, attended by a kindly physician whose expression radiated calm authority. No instruments were shown, no surgical mallets, no thin, glinting probes, only a soft focus rendering of tranquility, the sort one might expect from advertisements for fashionable seaside retreats. Inside parlours and reading rooms, the leaflets were received with curiosity and relief. Mrs. Alcott of Bayswater unfolded hers beside the breakfast tea and murmured, "Perhaps this is what poor Charlotte needs. She's been so excitable since Michaelmas." In Bloomsbury, a philosophy tutor skimmed the leaflet over a plate of toast and felt suddenly vindicated in his belief that modernity had finally produced a remedy for the rising tide of mental collapse. In Lambeth, a carpenter wiped sawdust from his hands and read the leaflet aloud to his wife, who clutched the hem of her apron, thinking of their eldest son so given to fits of melancholy, so recently beyond their understanding. Each household saw in the pamphlet what they most desperately sought: hope, and the leaflet offered it readily. In graceful prose, it explained, "The modern mind, fatigued by the demands of industrious society, may become congested with agitation. Through a minor adjustment of neural pathways, harmony may be restored. No mention of lobotomy, no reference to bone, only adjustment, restoration, harmony." Even the warnings were crafted like lullabies. Temporary quietness of affect may follow. This is a natural and welcome stage of recovery. Temporary, it said. Welcome, it said. Lies woven with silk. Dr. Whitcomb himself reviewed each line before publication, ensuring that the phrasing danced gracefully around the truth. London praised him for his discretion, unaware of how skillfully he shaped the narrative. He understood something the public was only beginning to grasp. Fear could be managed, even eliminated, if wrapped in the right kind of language. At the asylum, Superintendent Bellwether stacked the leaflets upon his polished desk in neat bundles, inhaling with satisfaction. "This will triple our referrals," he told Dr. Herrick with a self-satisfied gleam. "Families prefer to feel they are making an informed decision." Herrick's brow tightened. He lifted a leaflet as though it were a volatile specimen. "This borders on misrepresentation." Bellwether waved away the remark. "It is reassurance, Herrick. People need reassurance more than they need truth, particularly where madness is concerned." Nurse Dawes, passing the open doorway, caught sight of the pamphlets and felt her stomach turn. She had seen what restoration looked like: slackened faces, smiles without meaning, once bright eyes clouded by emptiness. She had watched patients leave the asylum more obedient, yes, but unmistakably diminished, as though an unseen sculptor had shaved away the contours of their inner selves. Yet she, like many others, held her tongue. The leaflets had begun their work. Soon the waiting lists lengthened. Letters requesting consultations arrived in careful script, sealed with trembling wax. Carriages pulled up to the asylum gates with increasing frequency, each bearing someone whose family believed salvation could be purchased through science. London, already eager for silence, now believed it had found the path. The leaflets continued to circulate, folded into coat pockets, delivered to physicians' offices, slipped discreetly into prayer books. Pretty things, promising peace. Paper lanterns leading the city into deeper shadow. And behind the asylum walls, the instruments were laid out once more, gleaming beneath gaslight, waiting for the next trembling soul lured by ink and false reassurance. The decision to surrender a loved one to the asylum was never made in the asylum itself. It was made in parlours, those genteel, lace-curtained rooms where London's respectability performed its quiet rituals of propriety. Here, beneath chandeliers glittering like frozen rain, families weighed the fate of sons, daughters, wives, and brothers with the same careful deliberation reserved for financial investments or marriage arrangements. On a fog-laden Tuesday afternoon, the Graces' parlour hosted such a discussion. Though the coal fire crackled warmly, the mood in the room felt chilled by something deeper than winter. Mr. Grace paced before the hearth with his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in a manner he believed conveyed paternal authority. Mrs. Grace sat upon the settee with a handkerchief crumpled in her lap, her eyes trained on the carpet as though searching for an answer woven into its ornate patterns. The leaflet folded and refolded into soft creases lay on the tea table, its elegant filigree curling like vines across the pale paper. The words "gentle operation" caught the lamplight with quiet persuasion. "We must consider the future," Mr. Grace said, each syllable clipped by impatience. "Eleanor cannot continue this way. The tremors worsen, she disrupts supper, she frightens the servants. What kind of life is that?" Mrs. Grace's voice wavered. She is frightened herself, Henry. Every time her hands tremble, she looks at me as though she's apologizing for something she cannot control. That is precisely why she must undergo the procedure, he insisted. Her suffering will be ended. Mrs. Grace did not reply. She gazed at Eleanor's abandoned sewing basket in the corner, needlework frozen, mid-stitch, the thread trailing like an unanswered plea. Once, their daughter's fingers had danced through embroidery hoops with such precision that visiting ladies envied her skill. Now, the trembling made even a teacup tremble perilously in her grasp. Upstairs, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the blurred forms of pedestrians move through the fog. Their shapes dissolved and reappeared, like ghosts inhabiting the edges of consciousness. She pressed her palms together in her lap, willing them to be still. They defied her. In another parlor across town, a different family debated in hushed tones. A nervous son, prone to melancholic spells, a widow whose grief had turned to muttering, a brother whose outbursts had become an embarrassment at the club. Each parlor carried the same scent of tea and dread, the same uneasy equilibrium between love and desperation. Yet the conversations moved with a peculiar elegance, as though madness itself had become a social inconvenience rather than a human tragedy. Families spoke not of souls, but of symptoms, not of inner lives, but of outward disturbances. London had grown too crowded, too noisy, too burdened by industrial strain to tolerate the untidy chaos of mental suffering. And so decisions of irreversible consequence were made with porcelain cups in hand. In certain households, resistance flickered. A younger sister argued fiercely that her brother needed rest, not knives. A mother cried that surgery upon the mind felt like trespassing upon the divine. But these voices were often drowned beneath the steady churn of Victorian logic. Order above all, obedience above discomfort, silence above unpredictability. When the Graces' decision was finally sealed, it happened quietly. Mr. Grace folded the leaflet once more. "We proceed," he said. "Dr. Whitcomb is a man of science. He offers certainty." Mrs. Grace nodded, not because she believed, but because despair had softened her into agreement. She pressed her hand to her mouth, muffling the sob that rose like something caught in her throat. And in parlours across London that week, similar agreements were reached. At similar tea tables, agreements wrapped in silk, sealed with sighs, and delivered to the asylum in neat handwritten envelopes. Outside, the fog deepened, thick with winter's breath. Inside, in warm, polished rooms, the fate of many trembling souls was settled with the turn of a wrist, the folding of a leaflet, and the quiet illusion that calm could be purchased without cost. London believed it had chosen peace. In truth, it had chosen silence. In every era, there are women whose voices refuse to fold neatly into the quiet corners society assigns them. In Victorian London, such women were tolerated only so long as their boldness remained charming, amusing, or useful. The moment a woman's voice grew too sharp, too insistent, too visible, the city found ways to silence her. And sometimes that silencing arrived not through scandal or exile, but through medicine wearing the mask of mercy. Mrs. Clarissa Hale did not consider herself disobedient. She merely spoke plainly. She voiced her opinions during dinner parties, challenged her husband's colleagues when their logic wavered, and refused to feign frailty when she felt strong. Her laugh was too hearty for some, her arguments too pointed, her intellect too unrestrained for a woman of her station, as whispered by neighbours who both admired and resented her. At first, her husband, Mr. Edmund Hale, tolerated this with patient discomfort. He assured his friends that Clarissa had a spirited temperament, as though she were a lively horse that required occasional reining in. But over time, as she questioned him more openly and contradicted him in front of others, the admiration in his eyes thinned into irritation. Then came the night she interrupted him at a charity supper, corrected him, publicly, decisively, with facts he had misremembered. The room had grown uncomfortably still. Edmund Hale's face had reddened, and though he forced a smile, something in him shifted permanently. It was around this time that the leaflets began circulating. A gentle operation for the overwrought mind, for restoring domestic harmony. A humane correction for excessive agitation. One morning, Edmund found Clarissa alone in the parlour, writing an editorial for a ladies' publication. The piece argued boldly that women deserved the right to speak on matters of law and morality. Her eyes flashed with conviction. Her ink strokes were confident, unapologetic. He watched her for a moment, and something cold settled behind his expression. "Clarissa," he said carefully, "I worry for you. You seem unwell lately." She looked up, surprised. "Unwell? I feel perfectly myself." "That is precisely what concerns me," he murmured. The next week she found herself sitting across from Dr. Whitcomb in a consultation she had not requested. He regarded her with the polite sympathy reserved for those whose fates had already been decided. "Your husband," he said, steepling his fingers, "believes you suffer from emotional agitation that compromises your well-being. He fears the strain of intellectual effort has destabilized your nerves." Clarissa laughed a short, incredulous sound. "My nerves are as sturdy as yours, doctor." Whitcomb offered a tight smile. Many patients say the same before acknowledging the burden they carry. "I carry only the burden of boredom," she said sharply, "and of men who fear women with opinions." Nurse Dawes, standing beside the door, suppressed the faintest flicker of admiration. Whitcomb made a note in his ledger. Outspokenness, social disruptiveness, heightened argumentative impulses. Clarissa's eyes widened. "Are you cataloguing my personality as illness?" He did not answer. Instead, he turned the leaflet on his desk toward her, letting its elegant print catch the lamplight. "We can help you," he said softly. "We can bring peace to your mind." "My mind," Clarissa replied, rising to her feet, "is the only part of me that does not require correction." But the decision was not hers to make. That evening, Mr. Hale signed the consent form with a flourish, comforted by the assurance that the procedure was gentle and restorative. He imagined returning home to a more agreeable wife, quieter, pliant, docile. A woman who would not interrupt him. The next morning, Clarissa was led through the asylum's doors. She walked with her head high, but Nurse Dawes saw the tremor in her steps, the trembling born not of illness, but of indignation and terror. When she emerged from the operating room hours later, her voice was gone. Not physically, her vocal cords remained intact, but something essential had been severed in the quiet interior of her mind. She answered questions softly, obediently, devoid of the fire that once animated every syllable she spoke. To her husband and to the superintendent, this marked success. To Nurse Dawes, it marked a funeral. London congratulated itself for having found another cure. But what it cured, in truth, was dissent. And Clarissa Hale, once too loud for her time, now sat in perfect silence. A silence purchased by fear and carved by a surgeon's steady hand. The Royal Society of Medical Advancement occupied an imposing building on Cavendish Square, its stone facade resembling an ancient temple more than a modern institution. Marble columns framed the entrance. Heavy velvet drapes muffled every sound within. Once inside, one might believe oneself transported not into a meeting hall, but into the antechamber of some solemn tribunal where the laws of life and death were quietly rewritten. It was here, beneath the soft glow of brass chandeliers and the faint aroma of cigars and preserved specimens, that London's most esteemed physicians assembled to discuss the new corrective operation for mental agitation. Invitations had been written in impeccable script, sealed with wax, and delivered only to men whose reputations carried weight. The gathering was exclusive by design. Progress, they believed, must first be examined by minds capable of appreciating it. Dr. Whitcomb arrived early, pausing for a moment at the foot of the staircase to compose himself. He knew what he intended to present, not merely a procedure, but a legacy. As he mounted the steps, the air prickled with anticipation. Inside the main hall, small clusters of physicians murmured over glasses of sherry, their voices low and resonant, like the faint buzz of bees within a cathedral dome. Dr. Herrick stood apart from the rest, his posture stiff, his eyes hollow with lingering doubt. He had debated whether to attend at all, but absence might have raised more questions than his presence could. When Whitcomb approached him with a genial smile, Herrick managed a courteous bow of the head. "Alistair," Whitcomb greeted warmly, "I trust your report is ready." Herrick's throat tightened. "Yes," he murmured, "though I've included certain observations, precautions, rather that we may wish to consider." Whitcomb's hand came to rest lightly on his shoulder. "Precautions are the clothing of uncertainty. Tonight, let us speak with confidence." Herrick said nothing. The chandelier's flickering light reflected in his troubled eyes. As the gathering was called to order, the physicians took their seats around a long mahogany table, polished to a mirror-like sheen. A hush fell over the room, a hush of expectation, curiosity, ambition. The Society's president, Sir Leonard Forsyth, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we are presented with a development that may alter the course of mental medicine. Dr. Nathaniel Whitcomb will introduce his findings." Whitcomb stepped forward, his posture straight, his manner serene. He placed a neatly bound portfolio upon the table and opened it with deliberate grace. The first page displayed diagrams of the frontal lobes, rendered in delicate ink lines that made the mind appear elegant, almost ornamental. "My esteemed colleagues," he began, "we stand at the cusp of a new age in neurological refinement. Our understanding of emotional pathways, once clouded by superstition and speculation, now allows us to intervene with unprecedented precision." He described the procedure with practiced eloquence, never mentioning bone fragments, the crack of orbital plates, or the hollow stillness that followed. Instead, he spoke of gentle adjustment, calming neural storms, and restoring domestic harmony. His voice flowed smoothly, its cadence soothing, persuasive. Around the table, heads nodded. Some stroked their beards thoughtfully, others scribbled notes. Even the skeptical leaned forward, enticed by the promise of mastery over the most chaotic realms of human behavior. But one question, soft and innocuous, drifted across the room. "And the risks?" asked Dr. Montague, a mild-mannered physician known for caution. Whitcomb's smile did not falter. Minimal, temporary reduction in affect, occasional quietness of expression, nothing compared to the torment these patients endure, unassisted. Herrick stiffened. Quietness of expression. He thought of Eleanor Grace, of Clarissa Hale, of Jacob Merton, of the dozens of others who now moved through the asylum like pale phantoms, their souls muted beneath a veneer of calm. He cleared his throat. "I believe, if I may, that further study is warranted before adopting widespread use. The long-term consequences remain uncertain." A murmur fluttered through the room. Some frowned, others exchanged glances. Sir Leonard Forsyth leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Dr. Herrick," he said calmly, "progress demands boldness. We cannot cower behind caution forever." Whitcomb nodded, grateful for the support. "Precisely. The suffering of our patients is immediate. Our intervention must be equally so." Herrick felt the weight of the room shift against him, as though his doubts were an inconvenience rather than a warning. He swallowed them, tasting bitterness. By the time the meeting adjourned, the consensus was clear. The operation would proceed toward formal recognition. Research committees would be established, papers published, wealthy patrons courted. The city, eager for calm, would embrace the procedure with open arms. As the physicians dispersed into the foggy evening, Gas lamps cast long shadows across their retreating forms. Herrick lingered on the threshold, staring into the mist where their silhouettes dissolved like fading conscience. Behind him, the hall glowed with warm lamplight, a place where polite men had just sanctioned a quiet violation, disguised as progress, and the city, hungry for order, would soon offer up more minds for its relentless, sharpened cure. In a secluded laboratory at the rear of the asylum, far from the wards, far from the lamplight where patients were walked and washed and whispered over, stood a slate chalkboard that had become the pride of Victorian neurological ambition. Across its dark surface sprawled an intricate constellation of lines, circles, arrows, and elegant handwriting. It was not a map of London, though it resembled one, nor a chart of the stars, though its fine white strokes gave the impression of distant constellations pressed into a human shape. It was, instead, the human mind as drawn by men who believed they had mastered its geography. Dr. Whitcomb stood before the board with a piece of chalk poised lightly between his fingers. A fresh line of dust clung to his coat, for he had spent the better part of the morning refining what he called the pathway map, a diagram meant to illustrate how emotions moved, how impulses sparked, where sorrow lived, and where tranquility might be compelled to reside. It was, in his eyes, the map of a country he intended to conquer. He drew a curved line through a section labelled Affective Ridge, then tapped a small oval marked Agitative Node. "Here," he murmured to Dr. Herrick, who stood reluctantly at his side, "is where emotional disorder originates, the seat of agitation, misfires, turbulence. Once severed, the mind must settle." Herrick rubbed a hand across his tired brow. "You speak of the mind as though it were a faulty machine. These chalk lines, Whitcomb, they suggest certainty where none exists." Whitcomb turned to him, brow arching. "All scientific frontiers begin in chalk. Theories first, proof after." Herrick's gaze drifted across the sprawling diagram. Some areas were labelled with confidence: temperate region, impulse corridor, memory valley. Others bore faint question marks, indicating uncertainty that Whitcomb refused to acknowledge aloud. At the far corner of the board was a small circle labelled selfhood, a term Herrick had never heard Whitcomb use in conversation, and one that troubled him to see so precariously outlined. A line drawn from this circle was broken at its midpoint, as though snapped by a tremor. "What of this region?" Herrick asked quietly, tapping the chalked circle. Whitcomb hesitated, a rare interruption of his sweeping confidence. "A speculative zone," he replied, "possibly involved in reflexive awareness, introspective reasoning, unnecessary burdens, in cases of severe agitation." Herrick felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Unnecessary? Whitcomb, that circle may represent the core of a person's mind, what makes them themselves." Whitcomb dismissed the concern with a wave. "And yet, when damaged, the patient still lives, breathes, eats, sleeps peacefully. All the bodily proofs of life remain. If anything, it suggests the self occupies far too much of the mind's space. Excess of personality is a common precursor to madness." Herrick stepped back as though struck. On a nearby table, case files lay open, displaying neat inked observations. Words like compliant and serene repeated themselves with mechanical consistency. Diagrams sketched beside them showed lines connecting Whitcomb's chalkboard regions to symptoms he claimed to cure. Herrick lifted one file, a woman whose post-operation notes described drastic reduction of self-directed thought. Another read absence of emotional turbulence. Beneath it, in a faint margin note, someone had written, "Stares at walls for hours, does not respond unless prompted." He closed the file slowly. "Whitcomb," he said, voice shaking, "your map charts obedience, not healing. It divides the mind into territories so you may conquer them." Whitcomb's eyes gleamed with something fervent. something dangerous. When a nation is unruly, one restructures it. Why should the mind be different? Herrick could not answer. For in that moment he realized that Whitcomb's chalk map was not merely an illustration, it was a blueprint for erasure, a diagram promising physicians the seductive illusion that the human soul could be partitioned, reconfigured, silenced with precision. Whitcomb tapped the chalk lightly against agitative node. "We eliminate disorder," he said softly, "and what remains is peace." But Herrick could see the truth beneath the powdery white lines. What Whitcomb called peace was nothing more than absence, the vacant quiet left after a cathedral's bells had been melted down for scrap. And as Whitcomb resumed drawing, chalk whispering against slate, Herrick felt a growing dread. The map before him was not of a mind restored, it was of a mind undone, charted, divided, erased with elegance. The new ward was unveiled on a Thursday morning, when the winter fog clung stubbornly to the asylum's eaves and seeped into every crevice of its stone exterior. The brass plate affixed beside its doorway gleamed with freshly polished pride. Neurocorrective Recovery Wing. A genteel title, chosen carefully. No hint of knives, no whisper of bone, only the quiet promise of refinement. Inside, the ward had been arranged with the elegance of a hotel and the sterility of a morgue. Rows of narrow beds stood aligned with geometric precision, each draped in crisp white linen. Gas lamps glowed softly behind frosted glass, casting diffused halos across the pale blue walls. The windows were high, the ceilings vaulted, the atmosphere deceptively calm. At first glance, one might imagine the place designed for convalescence, not containment. Superintendent Bellwether toured the ward with hands clasped smugly behind his back. "A marvel of modern medicine," he declared to the architects, who followed him with clipboards and nervous smiles. "We shall set a new standard for humane treatment." Humane, a word that fluttered uneasily in the stale air. Nurse Dawes, stationed near the entrance, surveyed the room with a heaviness she dared not voice. She had seen too many of these patients after their adjustments, the quiet ones, eyes dulled, movements slow, questions few. She wondered what humanity remained beneath the neat folds of their blankets and the tidy arrangement of their pillows. The first of the new arrivals was wheeled in before noon. Jacob Merton, the melancholic young man whose file Herrick had reviewed in despair, entered the ward with an expression that flickered between confusion and fatigue. His hair had not yet been brushed after surgery. Tiny flecks of dried blood clung to his temple, half hidden beneath the bandage. He blinked at the room, his lids heavy, like someone waking from an impossibly deep dream. "Where?" he began, but the question dissolved. His gaze drifted away, lost to some unreachable place within the newly muted corridors of his mind. Behind him came Mrs. Penbury, a woman once known in her neighborhood for scolding neighbors and slamming windows. Now she moved like a marionette whose strings had slackened. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. Instead, she smiled an eerie, fixed little smile that did not touch her eyes. Then Clarissa Hale arrived. She did not speak. She did not protest. She simply allowed herself to be guided into a bed near the window, her once fiery gaze extinguished to a faint, glassy sheen. Bellwether clapped his hands lightly. "Splendid," he said. "Order already returns." Dr. Whitcomb entered soon after, his demeanor floating somewhere between solemnity and triumph. He moved through the ward as though inspecting fine works of art, pausing to study each patient with clinical satisfaction. "You will note," he said to the attending staff, "that agitation diminishes within hours. The mind, once untamed, finds a natural quiet. It is as though a storm has passed." Herrick, standing at the back of the room, felt that quiet like a weight on his chest. He saw not peace, but absence, not recovery, but vacancy. Each patient lay or sat in a strange stillness, an unnatural hush that seemed to swallow the very air around them. Nurse Dawes approached Jacob Merton gently. "Jacob," she whispered, "do you know where you are?" He turned his head with agonizing slowness. "I feel quiet," he said. The same words Eleanor Grace had spoken. Words that now seemed less like an observation and more like a diagnosis. As the day went on, more patients arrived, shuffled in by attendants, guided into beds. Names entered into ledgers with neat inked strokes. The ward filled so quickly that by dusk, a soft murmur of subdued breathing was the only sign of life within it. No arguments, no sobbing, no pacing, no cries for help. Just rows of people who had once been troubled, vibrant, restless, passionate, furious, heartbroken, and were now uniformly still. Bellwether surveyed the room and sighed contentedly. "At last," he whispered, "a haven of calm." But to Nurse Dawes, who lingered long after the superintendent had left, the ward felt like something else entirely. A mausoleum for the living. A place where voices went in, but rarely came out the same, if they came out at all. The boy arrived on a bleak January afternoon, when the wind scraped against the asylum walls like a restless fingernail, and the sky hung low, swollen with snow that refused to fall. His name, Timothy Cleves, was written in a careful, looping hand on the intake ledger, though the word unruly beside it was scrawled with much heavier pressure, as if frustration alone had pressed the ink into the page. He could not have been more than 12. His boots were muddy from the journey, his coat threadbare, his hair stuck out at wild angles, not from neglect, but from restless fingers tugging at it in anxious bursts. As two attendants guided him across the entry hall, he craned his neck to stare at the tall ceilings, the stern-faced portraits, the polished brass fixtures, all with the frantic alertness of a sparrow darting from shadow to shadow. "What is this place?" he asked, voice thin but edged with defiance. No one answered. Dr. Herrick observed from the stairwell landing, his stomach tightening at the sight. A child. They had not yet operated on a child. He descended, steps echoing too loudly in the marble hall, and intercepted the attendants. "Why is he here?" Herrick demanded quietly. One attendant shrugged. "Father says the boy can't sit still, talks too much, fights at school, disobedient, disturbs the household." "Disturbs?" Herrick repeated, astonished. The other added, "They heard about the corrective treatment, believe it will set him right." With every word, Herrick felt a coldness advancing beneath his ribs. Timothy's father entered then, a tall, angular man with a stiff collar and a stiff manner to match. His eyes held no softness, only irritation worn thin by years of relentless propriety. "Doctor," he said, extending a gloved hand, "I assume you've received our letter." Herrick did not take the hand. "Your son is not ill." "He is impossible," Mr. Cleves corrected sharply. "We have tried tutors, discipline, prayer. Nothing works. He is a disruption in every room he enters. Your procedure will correct that." Timothy shrank against the wall, fists balled at his sides. "I'm not broken," he whispered. His father ignored him. Herrick felt a flicker of rage, quiet but hot. "He is a child," he said. "A spirited child, perhaps, but not a candidate for surgery." Mr. Cleves's jaw tightened. "Dr. Whitcomb has already accepted the case." Herrick closed his eyes briefly. Of course he had. Whitcomb arrived moments later, offering a gentle smile that seemed grotesquely out of place. "Timothy," he said, kneeling to the boy's height, "we intend to help you feel calmer, more agreeable. Won't that be nice?" Timothy glared at him with a fierceness. Herrick recognized a spark of selfhood, refusing to dim. "I don't want to be calm," he snapped. "I want to go home." "You see?" Mr. Cleves said triumphantly, defiant, insolent, disorderly, Whitcomb rose. "We will schedule the operation tomorrow morning." Herrick stepped between them before he realized he'd moved. "Nathaniel, this is madness. He is not suffering from agitation. He is suffering from being 12. Whitcomb's smile cooled. "The father has consented. Our duty is to the family." "And to the child," Herrick countered. But Mr. Cleeves's hand closed around his son's arm like a clamp. "The boy will obey," he said. Timothy struggled, but the grip held firm. "Please," the boy gasped, looking at Herrick, at anyone who might save him. "Please, don't let them." His plea was cut short as the attendants led him down the corridor. Herrick stood frozen, his breath fogging in the cold hallway air, his fists clenched so tightly his nails drew crescents into his palms. Whitcomb walked away without another word, the polished floor swallowing the sound of his footsteps. Later, Nurse Dawes found Herrick in the empty ward, staring at the blank bed where Timothy would soon lie. "They cannot," she whispered. "They can," Herrick replied, voice raw. "And they will." Outside, the wind finally dropped its burden of snow, soft flakes drifting past the windows like silent ashes. Inside, a child's fate had been sealed by signatures, and the Victorian belief that silence was preferable to spirit. By morning, the ward would gain another patient, and London, eager for calm, would lose another voice. At dawn, when the asylum was still wrapped in a hush, so fragile that even the gas lamps seemed reluctant to flicker, the ether room stirred to life. It was a narrow chamber tucked between the operating theatre and the supply corridor, a place seldom noticed by visiting families, yet essential to every transformation the asylum claimed as success. Here, amidst glass bottles and stoppered jars, the air hung heavy with sweet fumes that clung to clothing, hair, and thoughts long after one stepped outside. Nurse Beatrice Dawes unlocked the door with trembling fingers. She had been tasked with preparing the anaesthetic for the morning's first procedure, Timothy Cleeves, the unruly boy whose arrival had troubled her more deeply than she wished to admit. She told herself she had performed this routine hundreds of times: measure the ether, soak the cone, ensure the dosage matched Dr. Whitcomb's precise instructions. But today, her breath came shallowly, as if the very air had thickened with dread. The room smelled of secrets. Of all the scents in the asylum, carbolic soap, damp wool, iron, ink, the ether alone seemed alive. It shimmered faintly in the half-light, whispering its narcotic lullaby into the stillness. When Dawes unstoppered the bottle, a rush of sweetness burst forth, curling through the air like a too gentle ghost. She had always disliked this room. Patients who inhaled ether often mumbled half-coherent thoughts as they drifted toward unconsciousness, thoughts unshielded by pride, fear, or restraint. In that twilight between waking and oblivion, truths slipped loose. She had heard confessions, regrets, desires, prayers, and occasionally something darker. Ether coaxed out whatever the mind clung to most tightly, revealing fragments of the soul just before the surgeons carved it away. This morning, Dawes found she could not push from her mind the last things Miss Eleanor Grace had whispered while the mask descended. "Please, my hands, I can still feel," nor the murmured plea of Clarissa Hale, her once powerful voice reduced to a fearful tremor. "Do not quiet me. I was not made for silence." Such moments haunted Dawes, lingering like the fumes themselves. The ether carried their words. She felt them settling in her lungs, weaving themselves into her conscience. A sudden knock startled her. Dr. Herrick entered the room, dark circles beneath his eyes. He stood for a long moment without speaking, breathing the heavy sweet air as though steeling himself. "Herrick," Dawes whispered, "you shouldn't be here before the procedure. You know what they'll say." "I no longer care what they say," he replied softly. He approached the bottle on the table, tracing the curve of its glass with a trembling fingertip. "It is strange," he murmured, "how something so fragrant, so gentle on the senses, can usher a person toward the severing of their self. Dawes swallowed. The boy is terrified. As he should be, Herrick said bitterly. But terror changes nothing. His father has given consent. Whitcomb sees only opportunity. And Bellwether sees a model patient, Dawes finished. Silence filled the narrow chamber. Not the peaceful kind, but the oppressive silence born from shared helplessness. Herrick lifted the ether cone, turning it slowly in his hands. Dawes, when the patients breathe this in, do they ever speak of wanting the procedure? She shook her head. Never. Do they speak of relief? Only fear, she whispered, or longing, or confusion. They speak like people standing on the threshold of something they cannot escape. Herrick's jaw tightened. Dawes lowered her voice. Doctor, if this continues, the ward will be filled with people who look alive but aren't. Souls subdued by science, Herrick said bleakly. No, she corrected, meeting his eyes. Souls stolen by it. A sharp rap on the door interrupted them. Whitcomb's voice filtered through calm, authoritative, oblivious to the dread inside. Nurse Dawes, the patient is ready. Dawes capped the ether bottle, hands unsteady. The liquid inside sloshed softly, as though murmuring to itself. Herrick stepped aside but did not leave. He watched as she soaked the mask, the sweet vapors rising once more into the room, like a sigh resigning itself to fate. When she carried the ether cone down the corridor toward the operating theatre, the scent trailed behind her, a fragile ribbon of sweetness winding through cold stone halls. And though she did not look back, she felt Herrick's eyes upon her, and sensed that the ether carried not only secrets, but guilt spreading quietly, insistently, just as the lobotomy ward itself had begun to do. In the theatre ahead, a young boy waited beneath bright lamps, unaware that the last breath he took before losing consciousness would be one that stole more of him than he would ever recover. Before the operation, Jacob Merton had been known for his dreams, not the feverish, troubled sort that troubled the asylum's darker corridors, but gentle ones, quiet things he often recounted to Nurse Dawes with shy enthusiasm. He dreamed of climbing trees taller than chimneys, of sketching boats along the river, of hearing his mother hum a lullaby she'd sung before illness claimed her. His dreams were the last remnants of a world that had once belonged wholly to him. After the operation, they vanished. He lay in his narrow bed in the neurocorrective wing, hands folded neatly atop the blanket, eyes half open as though waiting for some unseen cue. His breath rose and fell with mechanical rhythm. His lashes did not flutter. His lips did not quiver with imagined conversations. His fingers no longer twitched in response to distant, half-remembered adventures. He slept, yes, but without motion, without restlessness, without evidence of an inner life. He slept like a statue sleeps. Nurse Dawes noticed it first. On the second night after Jacob's surgery, she conducted her rounds with her usual quiet devotion, adjusting blankets, checking pulses, whispering reassurance into the dim air. The gas lamps were turned low, their flames diffused into soft orbs that gave the ward an almost celestial stillness. Patients breathed shallowly in their beds, some murmuring incoherently, others shifting in half-formed nightmares. But Jacob lay utterly still. She approached him slowly, uncertain whether she feared waking him or feared the possibility that she could not. The boy's face was smooth, emptied of its restless expressions. She placed a gentle hand upon his shoulder. "Jacob," she whispered. He did not stir. She leaned closer. "Jacob, dear, are you dreaming?" The question was foolish, childish even, and yet something in her compelled her to ask. Dreams had always been his refuge, the one thread of color in the muted tapestry of asylum life. To imagine him without them felt like imagining a bird without wings. But Jacob did not respond. His sleep was a still pool with no ripples. The next morning, During the physician's rounds, Dawes hesitated before speaking. Dr. Whitcomb inspected Jacob with brisk satisfaction, noting the absence of agitation, the docile posture, the quiet compliance. He recorded each observation with the practiced poise of a man preparing a success story. "Doctor," Dawes ventured, her voice low, "he does not dream." Whitcomb did not look up. "Dreams are immaterial, nurse." The boy is calm. "But sir, he always dreamed before. He spoke of them often. Now he sleeps without movement, as though his mind is finally at peace." Whitcomb interrupted. "Exactly as intended." Dr. Herrick, standing just behind him, flinched at the phrasing. Dawes noticed. Whitcomb did not. After the doctors left, Herrick lingered by Jacob's bed, his brow full of silent turmoil. "Doctor," Dawes whispered, "you've seen this before, haven't you?" Herrick exhaled slowly, searching for an answer that did not exist. "I have seen patients lose memory, lose affect, lose speech." His eyes grew distant. "But dreams are the last spark. If those go out—" He did not finish the sentence. That afternoon, Dawes tried again to reach Jacob. She brought him a pencil and paper, once his favorite diversion. She placed them in his hands, curling his small fingers around the pencil. For a moment she imagined the faint stirrings of old habit. Perhaps he would draw a tree, or a riverboat, or the curved arch of clouds. Instead, he let the pencil fall. It clattered faintly against the floor. Jacob blinked at the sound, but only once. No confusion, no frustration, no recognition of lost ability, only quiet. Later that evening, as snow drifted against the window panes, Nurse Dawes sat beside him. The lamps flickered, the ward hummed with the shallow breaths of its subdued occupants. "Jacob," she murmured, voice trembling, "if you can hear me, if any part of you is still inside, please come back to us." But the boy's eyes remained half-lidded, his breaths steady and slow. He looked like someone who had journeyed so far inward that the world no longer reached him. Whitcomb called the outcome exemplary. Bellwether praised the reduction of nightly disturbances. The ledger recorded him as improved. But Dawes wrote her own truth quietly, in the privacy of her mind. This was not calm. This was extinguishment. Jacob Merton no longer trembled, nor cried, nor laughed. But neither did he dream. And a mind that could no longer dream, she realized, was not healed at all, only dimmed, as though someone had shuttered the last lantern inside a quiet, frightened child. In a city as restless as London, silence never lasts. Not even the kind manufactured behind asylum walls. It began with a whisper, one of those faint, uncertain murmurs that drifts through coffeehouses and omnibus queues like a loose thread, tugged absently until something unravels. A journalist from the London Courier, a small but persistent paper, overheard a peculiar remark in a Fleet Street tavern. "Have you seen them? The quiet ones. They return home, altered." The words lingered, ripe with potential scandal. And scandal, in a city starved for distraction, was nourishment. Within a week, rumours darted through marketplaces, tea rooms, and tram stops. Some swore they had seen a former patient walking in Kensington Gardens with the gait of a sleepwalker. Others whispered about a once talkative woman from Bloomsbury who now spoke only when prompted, her voice soft as candle smoke. The stories differed in detail, but all carried the same unnerving theme. The operation had gone too far. Or perhaps it had done exactly what it intended. By the time the press took notice in earnest, London was already vibrating with unease. The first article. The Sunday edition of the Courier featured a modest column titled, "New Treatment for Mental Distress Raises Questions." It was cautious, almost timid, framed with politeness to avoid offending the medical establishment. But beneath the politeness lay a quiet accusation. The journalist, a young man named Arthur Langley, wrote, We are told the procedure restores calm. Yet several families report that their loved ones return changed in profound and irreversible ways. Langley had attempted to interview Superintendent Bellwether, who refused comment, stating only that the benefits far outweigh any misinterpreted outcomes. But Langley persisted. He visited families, recorded their testimonies. A mother in Limehouse, tears pooling upon her apron, told him, "My boy sits still now, yes, but he no longer recognizes the sound of my voice." A gentleman in Mayfair claimed his wife was cured of her nerves, yet added with a trembling hand, "She has not laughed in 3 weeks." The article stirred quiet alarm among readers, but also emboldened curiosity. The ripples spread. Other papers soon followed. The Illustrated London News ran a more dramatic piece, "Surgery of the Mind, Miracle or Menace," accompanied by an engraving of a stern physician poised beside a reclining patient. The article speculated that Victorian medicine might be trespassing upon regions of the human soul best left untouched. Though the engravings were fanciful and the facts incomplete, the public devoured them eagerly. Parlours buzzed with debate. Clergymen raised concerns during sermons, and in the smoking rooms of gentlemen's clubs, men argued with the fervour of those who feared the operation could one day be recommended for them or their families. Even the wealthy, those who had once championed the procedure, felt a creeping chill at the edges of their confidence. Inside the asylum, Superintendent Bellwether reacted with fury. He stormed through the halls with a rolled newspaper clenched in his fist, striking it against his palm as though punishing the very ink it contained. "Sensational nonsense," he bellowed to the staff. "We offer progress, not peril. The public simply does not understand." Dr. Whitcomb was more measured but equally resolute. "We must respond with science," he said during an emergency meeting. "A detailed report, case studies, evidence. We cannot allow fearmongers to derail decades of innovation." But Dr. Herrick sat in the corner, pale and tight-lipped, the articles reflecting too clearly what he already knew. He could no longer pretend the outcomes were anomalies. The city was beginning to see what he had seen all along. Nurse Dawes, overhearing fragments of their meeting, felt a strange mix of hope and terror. If the city demanded answers, perhaps the truth might emerge. But she also knew the asylum held its secrets tightly behind thick brick walls, carefully phrased ledgers, and men of influence skilled in the art of polite denial. Public curiosity turns to pressure. By month's end, the papers were united in one sentiment. The asylum must answer for the growing number of altered patients. And though no mob gathered at its gates, though no protest banners flapped in the cold air, the pressure mounted in subtler, more insidious ways. Inquiries from Parliament, uneasy letters from benefactors, demands for transparency disguised as polite requests for clarification. For the first time, the asylum felt the gaze of London upon it, not admiring, not grateful, but questioning. And questions, in Victorian society, had a way of loosening even the most carefully arranged seams. Behind the ward's closed doors, the patients slept in their unnatural stillness, dreamless, obedient, emptied while outside. The city murmured with rising doubt. London had once begged for quiet. Now it began to fear the silence it had purchased. Long before the newspapers demanded answers, long before anxious families sent trembling letters to the asylum doors, one woman had already seen the truth taking shape. Nurse Beatrice Dawes, not a surgeon, not a scholar, not a man whose voice carried authority, was simply the one closest to the patient's bedsides. And proximity, she had learned, reveals what clinical distance conceals. She noticed it first in the eyes. Not immediately after surgery, those hours were filled with ether, fog and exhaustion, but in the days that followed, when the patient was expected to improve, their eyes grew too still, stiller than sleep, stiller than calm. They gazed forward with a dull sheen, pupils slow to contract, as though the world no longer demanded interpretation. The expressions that had once fluttered across their faces, fear, wonder, irritation, humor, longing, flattened until only the faintest echo of self remained. They looked like people listening for a sound that never came. Nurse Dawes could not ignore it. One evening, as snow sputtered against the ward's high windows, she guided Mrs. Clarissa Hale through the corridor. The once outspoken woman walked with hesitant steps, her hands folded neatly before her. Dawes whispered gentle reassurances, though she hardly knew if Clarissa comprehended them. "Mrs. Hale," she murmured, "are you feeling comfortable tonight?" Clarissa blinked once. Comfort, yes, but the word seemed chosen from a shelf rather than felt. "And your thoughts? Are they clear?" Another blink, slower this time. "No thoughts," Clarissa answered softly. Quiet, very quiet. Dawes's throat tightened. She recorded the observation later with a shaking hand. Patient compliant, docile, affect unnaturally muted, possibly incapable of independent thought beyond prompted response. She wanted to write more. She wanted to write, "This is not recovery," but the asylum had no column for that. A pattern emerges. The change appeared in every lobotomized patient, regardless of age, temperament, or prior affliction. Jacob Merton no longer drew, dreamed, or hummed. Eleanor Grace no longer trembled, but neither did she smile. Mrs. Penbury, known once for explosive tempers, now stared at the wall for hours, lips curved in a faint, eerie approximation of contentment. And young Timothy Cleves, Timothy sat on the edge of his bed with hands in his lap, swinging his feet, not from mischief, but from the mechanical repetition of someone who had forgotten why movement had ever meant anything at all. When Dawes asked him, "How are you feeling today?" he answered with the same words each morning. Good, quiet, good. The words felt memorized, not lived. Confronting the physicians, one cold evening, unable to contain the weight of her fears, Dawes approached Dr. Herrick as he stood alone near the ward's observation window. "Doctor," she said softly, "they are not themselves." Herrick turned, weary shadows etched deeply beneath his eyes. "I know." "Then why do the records call it improvement?" He swallowed. "Because no one with authority wishes to call it what it is." "And what is it?" she pressed. Herrick hesitated. The gas lamps flickered, turning his face pallid. "Loss," he whispered. "Irreversible loss." They stood together in shared dread, watching the patients move through their evening routines, brushing hair, folding garments, lying down to sleep, each action executed with the same quiet obedience, devoid of spontaneity, devoid of choice. It was as though the surgery had pressed a thumb down on the flame of each person's spirit, dimming it until only a faint ember remained. The breaking point. Dawes reached her limit the night she found Jacob sitting upright in his bed, eyes open in the dark. "Jacob," she whispered, touching his shoulder. "Are you awake?" "Yes," he said. "What are you thinking about?" He paused. For a long moment she dared to hope he might speak of trees or boats or warm memories of home. But instead he said, "Nothing. Everyone thinks about something," she insisted gently. "Not anymore," he replied. And in that moment, Dawes felt the truth settle heavily upon her chest. The operation did not quiet the mind. It emptied it. A lonely witness. Though she recorded every troubling observation in her private notes, Dawes knew her voice would never outweigh the authority of the men who championed the procedure. She was a nurse, not a doctor. A woman, not a man. And in Victorian London, truth spoken by the wrong person was as good as silence. But she kept noticing, kept writing, kept watching the light dim behind the eyes of those entrusted to her care. In a city that celebrated calm and feared disorder, Nurse Dawes alone recognized the price of such quiet, and with each passing day, the ward grew quieter still. a quiet so deep it felt less like healing and more like mourning. It was said that Mr. Nathaniel Ashcombe, before the operation, could command a ballroom simply by entering it. He was a gentleman of impeccable breeding, a solicitor of considerable talent, and a man whose memory once served him like a loyal valet. Dates, debts, names, legal precedents, nothing ever slipped his grasp. He remembered every courtesy extended to him and every slight delivered against him. His mind, polished and exacting, was the tool upon which his entire life was built. Until it wasn't. His decline had been subtle at first, a tremor in his left hand during morning tea, a moment of lost direction on his way to chambers, a hesitation barely noticeable when greeting an acquaintance at the opera. His wife, Clara, dismissed these lapses as mere fatigue. But London society is razor-edged. A misplaced word can wound more deeply than a knife. Soon, whispers spread that Mr. Ashcombe was becoming forgetful, and forgetfulness, in men of stature, is treated not as illness, but as scandal. Clara, fearful of disgrace, clutched eagerly at the leaflets promising correction. And so the gentleman found himself beneath the sweet, numbing haze of ether, surrendering his mind to surgical refinement. When he awoke in the lobotomy ward, the world came to him with a softness that frightened Nurse Dawes more than any outburst ever could. He blinked slowly, studied the ceiling, turned his head toward the window as if trying to place the concept of light itself. "Mr. Ashcombe," Dawes said gently, brushing a wrinkle from his sheet, "how do you feel?" He looked at her with eyes that seemed polished, smooth like river stones worn down by years of rushing water. His lips moved, forming shapes that did not yet know how to become words. "Quiet," he murmured. The familiar answer, the chilling one. "And your name?" Dawes coaxed. He paused. The question floated before him like a feather caught in still air. His brow furrowed as though he were attempting to grasp it. Then, "I don't know." The words fell with the soft weight of a funeral shroud. Dawes felt her heart tighten. She checked the chart at the foot of his bed, where his name was inked in bold script. "You are Mr. Nathaniel Ashcombe," she said gently. "A solicitor, a respected man." He blinked at her again, as though hearing the biography of a stranger. "Is that so?" he replied, tone polite but vacant. A visit from Clara. Clara Ashcombe arrived 2 days later, gloved and veiled, her perfume drifting ahead of her like a memory of the life she hoped to retrieve. She carried a monogrammed handkerchief and a framed miniature of her husband as he once was, chin lifted, gaze sharp, grievance meticulously hidden beneath civility. When she reached his bedside, she clasped his hand. "Nathaniel," she whispered, "my dear heart, I'm here." He looked at her steadily, without recognition. "Are you a nurse?" he asked. The gasp that escaped her was small, strangled. "Nathaniel, it's Clara, your wife." He repeated the word as though testing its texture. "Wife." "Yes," she insisted, lifting the miniature so he could see the proud, confident man he once had been. "This is you!" He studied the portrait for a long time, too long. His eyes drifted between the painted face and the real one, searching for a connection that no longer existed. "I do not know him," he said softly. Clara's gloved hand trembled violently. She turned away, pressing the handkerchief to her lips. Dr. Whitcomb, standing nearby, spoke with quiet authority. "His agitation has been entirely resolved. No more episodes, no more distress. He is at peace." Clara spun toward him, eyes blazing with grief. "But he has forgotten himself." Whitcomb offered a sympathetic nod that did not reach his eyes. "Identity is often the heaviest burden of the mind. We have relieved him of it." Herrick, standing at the doorway, felt bile rise in his throat. A gentleman unmade. In the days that followed, Mr. Ashcombe wandered the ward with the polite confusion of a man visiting a house he had once owned but no longer recognized. He thanked the nurses for their efforts, though he could not remember their names. He admired the architecture of the asylum, unaware he had helped fund one of its wings. He forgot mealtimes. He forgot conversations. He forgot the face of his wife even as she sat beside him. But worst of all, he forgot himself. His past, his ambitions, his griefs, his triumphs, everything that had sculpted him into the man he once was, had been severed with the precision of a surgeon's hand. Clara eventually stopped visiting, not because she ceased loving him, but because the man she loved no longer existed. And as Mr. Ashcombe sat serenely in his bed, humming tunelessly to himself, Nurse Dawes wrote a quiet truth in her private notes. The operation has cured nothing. It has only erased. London had wanted calm. Instead, it created a new kind of orphan, a man alive in body, but severed from the story of his own life. Dr. Alistair Herrick had always possessed steady hands. It was the trait upon which his entire career had been built, the quiet certainty that when steel met flesh, when bone met instrument, when a mind was entrusted to him in its most vulnerable state, he would not falter. Precision was his sanctuary, control his creed. But on a bleak February morning, as pale sun trembled behind a veil of winter fog, Herrick stood in the operating theatre, staring at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. They shook subtle at first, a faint tremor fluttering across his fingers like the wing-beat of a frightened bird, a tremor that no surgeon could afford. He clasped them tightly behind his back, hoping the attendants had not seen. The theatre lay in its usual stark quiet. The gas lamps hummed faintly. The instruments glimmered in neat rows upon the linen-draped table. The ether cone exhaled its sweet, narcotic perfume into the chilled air. Everything looked undisturbed, everything except Herrick himself. Dr. Whitcomb entered moments later, his expression composed, his gait measured, his confidence so absolute it seemed to repel doubt from the room entirely. "You are early," he remarked, removing his gloves with elegant precision. "That is good. We have a full schedule today." Herrick nodded but said nothing. A young woman lay upon the table awaiting preparation, slight, pale, no older than 20. Her hair spilled across the pillow like dark ribbons. A faint scar along her wrist hinted at the desperation that had brought her to the asylum. Whether she had sought quiet or merely been placed here by someone else, Herrick did not know. But he knew what this procedure would do to her. He had seen its aftermath too many times. Whitcomb adjusted the overhead lamp. She is a delicate case. Severe emotional jags, hysterical fits. Her family fears she may harm herself or embarrass them. A successful operation will restore order. Order. Always order. Herrick looked down at his trembling fingers, then at the patient's serene, unconscious face. She seemed to float between worlds already, her breath shallow beneath the ether's soft glaze. "Whitcomb," Herrick murmured, "we should reconsider." Whitcomb paused, not in uncertainty, but in annoyance. "Alistair, we have discussed this. The press has stirred unnecessary alarm. It is our duty to continue proving the value of our work. But the consequences," Herrick's voice cracked, "they are permanent. These patients lose more than agitation. They lose themselves." Whitcomb's smile thinned into something sharp. "You are becoming sentimental. Progress is not achieved without cost." Herrick's hands trembled visibly now. He curled them into fists, trying to will away the shaking, the guilt, the memories. Eleanor Grace's empty eyes, Jacob Merton's dreamless sleep, Clarissa Hale's extinguished fire, Timothy Cleaves's hollow compliance, Nathaniel Ashcomb's lost identity. One by one, their altered faces flickered in his mind, like lanterns dimming along a darkened street. Whitcomb noticed the tremor. "Your hands," he said softly. "Alistair, you must steady yourself. Our work demands precision." Herrick swallowed hard. "I cannot continue if what we do destroys the soul." Whitcomb's expression hardened. "You speak of souls as though they have anatomical coordinates. We treat the mind. Disorder is a burden. We relieve it. The patients are calmer afterward. That is what matters." Herrick stepped back, breath unsteady. Calm is not life. The attendants exchanged uncertain glances. The patient exhaled beneath the mask, the sound delicate and haunting. The room felt suddenly too small, too suffocating, as though the walls themselves tightened around Herrick's conscience. Whitcomb lifted the surgical instrument, the slender probe that had altered so many lives, and held it out to Herrick. "Are you assisting?" he asked quietly. "Or are you abandoning your profession?" Herrick stared at the instrument, at its polished surface, at the faint scratches that bore witness to past operations, at the cold gleam that reflected his own trembling face. A breath shuddered through him. His hands would not stop shaking. He stepped back. "I cannot," he whispered. "Not today." Whitcomb's eyes narrowed, not with empathy, but with calculation. "Very well, I will proceed alone." As Herrick left the theatre, the sound of the first tap of Whitcomb's mallet echoed faintly behind him, soft, precise, devastating. It reverberated through the corridor like a heartbeat made of bone. Herrick pressed a hand to the wall to steady himself. For the first time in his career, he feared his hands were shaking, not because he was losing control, but because he was finally seeing clearly. On most evenings, the asylum breathed like a restless creature, soft murmurs drifting from the women's ward, the occasional cry puncturing the men's corridor, the shuffling of slippered feet, the low clatter of attendants making rounds. Even the walls seemed to carry an undertone of life, quivering with the accumulated unease of those confined within. It was never truly quiet, but on the night the asylum fell silent, the quiet arrived not as a comfort, but as something heavy, unnatural, and strangely expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks, or the held breath between two heartbeats. Nurse Beatrice Dawes first noticed it during her rounds just after dusk. She stepped into the neurocorrective wing, expecting the usual subdued murmurs, the fragile chorus of human presence. Instead, she found only stillness. The lamps flickered gently, their flames steady as if held in gloved hands. The air was thick with the faint sweetness of ether, though no procedure had taken place in hours. The patients lay in their beds or sat in their chairs with unnerving uniformity. Jacob Merton rested with open eyes that did not blink. Mrs. Penbury sat upright, hands folded neatly, her eerie smile extended like a crack in porcelain. Clarissa Hale stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass in perfect, rhythmic intervals. Yet she made no movement, no sound, no sign of awareness. Young Timothy Cleeve sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the seam where the wall met the tile. His small hands rested in his lap. He did not hum, he did not fidget, he did not speak. Silence wrapped around them all like a shroud. Dawes approached the nearest patient, a middle-aged man named Mr. Rowan, once prone to restless pacing. "Mr. Rowan," she whispered. No response, not even a flicker of recognition. She touched his shoulder. His head turned mechanically, like a marionette responding to its strings. "Yes," he said in a flat tone. "Yes, what, sir?" "Yes," he repeated. His eyes did not change. His posture did not shift. He returned to facing forward without being prompted. Dawes stepped back, her heart beating against her ribs like a warning. She moved quickly from bed to bed, from face to face, testing every voice, every expression, every glimmer she once relied on to distinguish life from vacancy. All of them answered her, but none truly responded. Their voices were soft, polite, identical, as though their minds had been pressed through the same narrowing corridor and emerged diminished, smoothed, stripped of edge or individuality. A chill crept across Dawes's neck. She hurried to find Dr. Herrick. She found him in the records room, bent over a ledger lit by a single oil lamp. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. When Dawes burst in, breath quickened, he straightened, alarmed. "Doctor, it's the patients," she whispered urgently. "They are too quiet." He blinked. "Too quiet?" "Yes, not one of them moves unless spoken to. They answer, but without thought, without intention. It's as though they share a single mind." Herrick's face drained of colour. He seized his coat and followed her, striding through the dark corridor. When they reached the ward, he stopped abruptly. The silence met him like a wall. Row upon row of patients sat or lay motionless, eyes glazed, breaths shallow. It resembled not a hospital, not a place of healing, but a gallery of human statues arranged with meticulous precision. Herrick approached Jacob. "Jacob, it's Dr. Herrick. How do you feel?" Jacob turned his head with slow deliberation. "Quiet," he said. "And what are you thinking?" "Nothing." Herrick swallowed hard. He turned to Clarissa Hale. "Mrs. Hale, do you recognize me?" "Yes." "Who am I?" "You are the doctor." "What is my name?" "You are the doctor," she repeated. Her breath fogged the glass again, steady, unbroken, a living metronome. Herrick stepped back, his hand trembling. "This is more than expected, more than intended. Nathaniel must be told." But Nathaniel Whitcomb did not arrive when summoned. Superintendent Bellwether did. He swept through the ward with brisk impatience, his cane striking the tile with authority. "What is the meaning of this disturbance? The patients appear perfectly calm." "Calm?" Herrick exclaimed. "Look at them, really look, Bellwether. This is not calm. This is devastation." Bellwether glanced around with a practiced eye, seeing only what suited him. "I see order, improvement, compliance, exactly what families were promised." "They are hollow," Dawes said, voice trembling. "Listen to them, or rather listen to what is missing." Bellwether frowned, irritated. "Nurse, do not indulge melodrama. This ward, this entire institution finally runs smoothly. I will not have it disturbed by fanciful interpretations of progress." Dawes's breath hitched. Herrick looked defeated, the weight of helplessness settling into his bones. Then the lamps flickered. The room dimmed. For one suspended moment, the entire ward seemed to inhale. And when the light steadied again, the silence remained. But now it felt sentient, aware, as though the collective stillness of the patients had deepened into something new, something watchful. That night, long after Bellwether left, Dawes and Herrick remained in the ward, unable to shake the feeling that they were standing inside a cathedral where the congregation had lost their prayers. The asylum had fallen silent, and in that silence, the truth whispered with terrible clarity. The minds were gone, but the bodies remained. In the austere, book-lined office of the asylum's medical director, a single sheet of paper lay upon the polished oak desk, its edges crisp, its ink still faintly fragrant with iron and caution. The memo had been written by a conscientious junior physician, Dr. Alistair Herrick, detailing the immediate and troubling consequences of the latest procedures: the vacant stares, the absence of speech, the loss of initiative, the flattening of every spark of personality. He had labelled it, carefully, "Observations on the post-operative condition of lobotomized patients. Urgent consideration required." It was a document meant to safeguard lives, meant to provoke reflection. Instead, it would be buried. Superintendent Horatio Bellwether entered the office with his usual brisk stride, brass-tipped cane tapping in measured cadence. He paused at the threshold, eyes narrowing at the sight of the memo. "What is this?" he demanded. Herrick straightened, his chest tight. "Sir, it is an accurate report on the condition of our patients. I believe the public and the families have a right to know the full consequences." Bellwether lifted a hand, dismissive. "Consequences? My dear man, these are minor perturbations. The patients are calm, compliant, manageable, exactly as we promised. The city demands order. Families demand tranquility. You would jeopardize that with, what? Alarmist observations? Herrick swallowed, his gaze drifting to the polished floor. Sir, I do not call it alarmist. I call it truth. The procedure does more than quiet agitation. It removes the capacity for independent thought. Patients comply, yes, but they no longer dream, plan, question, or resist. They are hollow. Bellwether's jaw tightened. Hollow? You overstate. Perhaps your conscience unsettles you. Do not confuse moral discomfort with clinical error. We have a duty to uphold the institution's reputation. That is your duty as well. Herrick felt the paper's weight in his hands, heavier than any instrument he had ever lifted in surgery. Reputation, he said quietly, is built on half-truths. These patients, Miss Eleanor Grace, Clarissa Hale, Jacob Merton, Timothy Cleves, Nathaniel Ashcombe, they are diminished. I cannot remain silent. Bellwether's expression darkened. Then perhaps your position requires reconsideration. I will not allow this memo to leave my desk. It contains content unfit for circulation. The board must see only what confirms our excellence. Herrick's hands trembled not from ether or fever, but from the sheer, icy weight of authority bending moral judgment to its will. He tried to protest further, but Bellwether's presence, imposing as a carved statue, smothered his words. With a curt motion, Bellwether took the document from Herrick and placed it in a locked drawer. We shall speak of this no more, he said. The families will receive standard reports. The public will see only success. Your concerns are noted and contained. Herrick stared at the closed drawer. Contained. That word lingered like the faint aroma of ether still clinging to the hallways. Contained, but never erased. Later, as he wandered through the dimly lit corridors of the neurocorrective wing, Herrick glimpsed the patients in their beds or seated quietly by the gaslit windows. Each one's eyes reflected the absence described in his memo: calm, obedient, empty. He recognized them individually, yet in their collective silence they seemed to belong to no one at all. Nurse Dawes followed him in silence, sharing the same dread he could not voice aloud. Together they observed how the ward breathed as one, a quiet, unnatural rhythm, a chorus of bodies and minds subdued beyond recognition. Herrick understood then what suppression meant, not only of the memo, but of truth itself. The city would hear only that the procedures worked. The families would read only reassurance. And those who had once been vibrant, restless, human, would remain invisible beneath a veneer of compliance. The memo, locked away in the polished oak drawer, would serve as a silent witness to the cost of ambition, precision, and Victorian propriety. And somewhere in the dark, quiet wing of the asylum, the patients, dreamless, obedient, untroubled by their own erasure, rested in the stillness of progress. London would never know, and the truth would remain suppressed. The day Mrs. Penelope Hargrave arrived at the asylum, the winter fog pressed low over London like a shroud. Gas lamps flickered weakly along the cobblestones, their light diffused by the mist. Even the wind seemed hesitant, curling around corners and doorways in soft, unsure spirals, as if it too sensed the dread awaiting within the asylum walls. She had come not merely as a visitor, but as a crusader of sorts, a widow determined to reclaim what had been lost to her family. Her late husband had been a patient, brought to the neurocorrective wing under the assurances of gentle treatment, relief from agitation, and restored harmony. She had trusted those promises, and now she carried the bitter weight of betrayal. The front hall swallowed her footsteps, the polished tile reflecting her black-clad figure. She passed attendants with polite nods and climbed the narrow staircase to the ward. Every step pressed her heart deeper into a knot of fear and rage. At the entrance to the neurocorrective wing, she paused. The ward appeared serene, almost peaceful. Patients sat in neat rows or lay in beds, with hands folded, eyes blank, faces calm as if carved from alabaster. The nurses moved quietly among them, adjusting blankets and whispering gentle words that were met with obedient compliance. "Where is my husband?" she demanded of a young attendant, voice trembling yet firm. The boy bowed slightly. "He is in bed, ma'am. Resting. Resting." The word echoed hollowly in the hall. Mrs. Hargrave pushed past the attendant, entering the room with a small flourish of desperation. Her eyes swept across the ward until they fell upon her husband. He sat upright, hands folded neatly in his lap, his head tilted slightly toward the window, eyes vacant. She recognized the man's features, yet he seemed entirely foreign, an automaton, obedient, composed, yet missing the spark that had once defined him. "Henry!" she cried, rushing to his side. "It is I, Penelope." He turned slowly, lips parting as though to speak. "Who are you?" Her knees nearly buckled. "I am your wife." He blinked as though trying to grasp meaning, then nodded once faintly. "Wife," he repeated. The word had no warmth, no recognition, only polite repetition. Mrs. Hargrave pressed closer, touching his arm. "Do you remember me? Your home? Our children?" "I do not know," he murmured softly. She staggered back, clutching the nearest chair to steady herself. Tears welled in her eyes, a quiet storm of grief and fury. The silence of the ward pressed in on her. Even the other patients seemed frozen in their own polite obedience, witnessing nothing yet understanding everything. At that moment, Dr. Whitcomb entered, accompanied by Superintendent Bellwether. Whitcomb's expression was calm, composed, serene. "Mrs. Hargrave," he said gently, "your husband has undergone a procedure designed to relieve agitation. He is now calm, compliant, and free from distress." "Free from distress." She spat the words. "Do you call this freedom? He does not know me. He does not remember his children. He does not dream. He is not alive in the way he was." Bellwether's face tightened. "Madam, your husband's condition is considered exemplary. The treatment was successful." "Successful?" she shouted. "You have stolen him from me. You have stolen his mind, his soul, his very being. He obeys without thought, answers without comprehension. This is not treatment, it is obliteration." Her voice carried through the ward, bouncing softly off the high ceilings. For a brief moment, the gas lamps flickered, as though acknowledging her accusation. The attending nurses lowered their eyes. The patients remained still, their breath steady, untroubled, yet somehow complicit in their own absence. Whitcomb inclined his head. "I understand your grief, Mrs. Hargrave, but the procedure was necessary. It brought peace where none existed before." She shook with rage and sorrow. "Peace? You call this peace? You have taken from me the man I loved. You have replaced him with a shadow." Bellwether's expression remained impassive. "Madam, the procedure is approved by the board. You may record your complaint, but it will not alter the outcome." Mrs. Hargrave turned toward her husband, silent tears streaking her cheeks. She reached for his hand one final time. It rested cold, still, polite a hand of a man she no longer knew. As she was escorted from the ward, her whispered cries echoed faintly through the halls, a sorrowful cadence against the steady hum of obedient breathing. And inside the neurocorrective wing, the patients remained undisturbed, silent witnesses to the grief their compliance had wrought. The widow's accusation would not be forgotten entirely. But in the polished, gaslit halls of the asylum, truth was a whisper lost beneath the carefully maintained calm. The demonstration had been planned with meticulous precision. Dr. Whitcomb, eager to cement his reputation as a pioneer of neurological refinement, arranged for a select audience of physicians, philanthropists, and wealthy patrons to witness a live procedure. Invitations were embossed in gold, delivered in elegant envelopes scented with lavender, promising an evening of education and progress. Few would have guessed that behind the gilded facade, the air would carry a subtle, creeping dread. The operating theatre was prepared as always, lamps polished, instruments aligned with mechanical perfection, tables draped in fresh linen. The ether cone rested nearby, sweet vapor ready to carry the patient into unconsciousness. Yet despite the careful arrangements, a hush had fallen over the assembled crowd, a tension too fine to name, threading through the audience like a single quivering string. The patient chosen for the demonstration was a young woman, recently admitted for severe emotional agitation, whose family had consented to the procedure with nervous optimism. Her name was Anne Carraway, though few in the room knew it. To the audience, she was simply the case of exemplary success, a living testament to Victorian medicine's promise of order over chaos. Whitcomb greeted the assembly with his usual serene composure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice calm and measured, "today you will witness a procedure that restores tranquility where disorder once reigned. Observe carefully, and you will see the mind rendered obedient, yet unharmed." The patient lay upon the table, hands bound gently, face pale under the soft glow of the gas lamps. Her breath rose and fell in slow, quivering waves, carrying the scent of ether that lingered in the air like a perfumed warning. Nurse Dawes adjusted the pillow behind her head, a faint tremor in her hand betraying her apprehension. Whitcomb lifted the slender surgical instrument, positioning it above the orbital bone with the poise of a conductor raising a baton. A hush fell over the audience, punctuated only by the gentle click of his gloves and the soft rustle of silk and lace in the front row. Then came the first tap of the mallet light, precise, almost courteous. The crack of bone, faint yet unmistakable, echoed through the theatre. For a moment, all seemed well. The patient's eyes fluttered beneath the ether, her body slackening in obedient repose. Whitcomb smiled, gesturing to the audience with subtle pride. Observe the calm instant and complete. And then, unexpectedly, the body twitched violently. A sharp cry pierced the room, more human than the demonstrations had prepared them to hear. The young woman's limbs flailed with a sudden, uncontrolled energy that threw the carefully arranged instruments onto the floor. Nurses rushed forward, hands trembling, trying to restrain her, while some members of the audience gasped and recoiled. The elegant, calm Whitcomb had promised dissolved instantly, replaced by chaos too vivid for polite veneer. Herrick, standing at the back, felt a cold surge of dread. This was what he had feared all along, the illusion of mastery cracking under the weight of human unpredictability. He recognized in her movements the desperate, unfiltered responses that no instrument, no mallet, no procedure could fully erase. Whitcomb attempted to regain composure, voice raised over the commotion. "Control her. Steady. Observe the effect remarkable. Indeed, once we—" But the words fell flat. The patient's resistance was palpable, alive, a reminder of the autonomy that medicine sought to suppress. Even the audience felt it, a raw, urgent energy emanating from the bed, refusing the confines of order and expectation. Finally, with great effort, the nurses subdued her. Whitcomb replaced the instruments, brushing off the chaos with a strained smile, murmuring reassurances that the procedure had been entirely successful. But the audience had seen something deeper. The fragility of control, the cost of compliance, the shadow that always lingered behind the veneer of calm. As the guests departed, whispers followed them into the foggy night. Some praised Whitcomb's ingenuity, while others questioned the ethics, the safety, and the humanity of what they had witnessed. And in the theatre, still scented with ether and faint terror, the patient lay quietly, once more compliant, subdued, but changed in ways no one yet dared name. The demonstration had gone wrong, but it revealed the truth the public would not see. Tranquility imposed by steel and ether was never peaceful. It was conquest. Dr. Alistair Herrick did not leave the theatre that night. He lingered in the still, perfumed aftermath of the demonstration, moving silently among overturned instruments and scattered linens, his mind not on procedure, but on consequence. The echoes of Anne Carraway's terrified cry lingered in his ears like a refrain from which there could be no reprieve. He could still see her limbs jerking against the restraints, the desperation in her eyes, before ether smoothed them into compliance, the sudden, haunting calm that followed. He knew the audience had seen only a sliver of the truth, the brief eruption of rebellion, and yet even that flicker had sown doubt among them. For Herrick, however, the real revelation was more intimate, more personal. The realization that he too had been part of something monstrous. He wandered to the observation gallery, where the last traces of polite applause had faded into the silence of the empty hall. The brass fixtures gleamed faintly under gaslight, and the room smelled of disinfectant, ether, and the faint iron tang of spilled blood. Each gleam reflected not pride, as Whitcomb would see it, but guilt a mirror to the lives quietly altered by their hands. Herrick seated himself in the shadowed corner, head resting against the cool wall. His hands trembled, not from fatigue but from a deeper, unrelenting awareness. He had performed dozens of these procedures under Whitcomb's direction. He had seen Eleanor Grace emerge calm yet dreamless, Clarissa Hale muted, Jacob Merton empty of imagination, Nathaniel Ashcombe adrift from identity itself. All had been presented as triumphs, and yet, in each measured success, Herrick discerned the same haunting pattern. Humanity diminished, voices silenced, souls dimmed. He replayed each face in his mind, as though flipping through a ledger of lost lives. Eleanor, her tremors gone, but her curiosity extinguished. Clarissa, once defiant, now polite in speech and hollow in thought. Jacob, whose dreams had vanished entirely. Ashcombe, who no longer recognized his wife, his family, or himself. The procedures were framed as progress, but progress, Herrick realized with growing horror, had a price. And the currency was always the patients themselves. He remembered the demonstration, the flailing, terrified eruption of Anne Carraway, before she too was reduced to obedient stillness. Her terror had pierced the theatre, invisible to the public, yet indelible in Herrick's mind. Even Whitcomb, composed and unflinching, had paused for the briefest second, perhaps sensing the horror beneath the polished veneer. Herrick wondered if the younger man had ever seen it, truly, or if he had buried it immediately beneath ambition. Herrick's gaze drifted to the ledger of cases in his lap, each patient's name recorded with neat, authoritative ink. Each observation phrased to please the administration, to assure the public, to satisfy the families. Each one a testament not to health, but to compliance. He traced the lines with a finger, feeling the subtle imprint of guilt that the pen had left on the page. The room remained silent. The shadows of the ward crept along the walls like elongated fingers, reaching toward him, reminding him that these were not abstractions, these were lives. For hours, Herrick sat there, haunted by his own complicity. He understood that he could never undo what had been done. The patient's obedience was irreversible. The city, eager for calm, would celebrate the procedures as miracles. And he, who had wielded instruments with care and precision, could not reconcile his skill with the devastation it wrought. By the time dawn's faint light crept through the high windows, he rose, hands still trembling, heart heavy with unspoken truths. He would continue his duties, perform his observations, maintain appearances, and record successes. But inside, Herrick knew he carried a burden far heavier than any ledger, any surgical record, any public praise could measure. The weight of lives altered irrevocably, and the haunting knowledge that every triumph in the name of calm was a quiet tragedy of the human spirit. The ward remained still as he passed, patients obedient in their dreamless calm, the ether lingering faintly in the air like a ghost of conscience. Herrick walked away, but the faces followed him. They would follow him always, The back room of the asylum was narrow, dimly lit by a single gas lamp that cast wavering shadows against the pale walls. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wax polish, tinged with the residual sweetness of ether that had seeped from the operating theatre above. Here, far from the public eye and the orderly hush of the wards, Dr. Whitcomb, Superintendent Bellwether, and the senior attendants gathered to discuss matters too delicate for polite conversation. The demonstration of Anne Carraway's procedure, which had gone awry despite its eventual success, weighed heavily on the minds of those present. Though the audience had been placated, whispers had begun to circulate in the city, the faintest suggestion that all was not as serene as the published accounts claimed. London, with its insatiable appetite for gossip and scandal, required careful management. Whitcomb leaned against the edge of the table, hands clasped, posture composed. "Gentlemen," he began, voice measured and smooth, "we have received some inquiries regarding the procedure. Understandable, of course. Public curiosity is unavoidable when one attempts such revolutionary methods. Yet I assure you, all outcomes are within expectations." Bellwether's fingers drummed nervously against the polished surface. "Expectations, perhaps," he murmured, "but there are reports. Mothers claiming their daughters no longer recognize them. Families reporting dreamless sleep, vacant expressions. How are we to manage these claims?" Whitcomb's eyes glimmered with that calm conviction that had so often silenced dissent. "We manage them as we always have, with discretion, authority, and careful framing. The public must see only tranquility, obedience, improvement." An attendant cleared his throat, shifting uneasily. "Sir, some of the nurses are troubled. They speak of patients sitting quietly, but responding only when prompted. Some of the younger ones, Jacob Merton, Timothy Cleves, are nearly catatonic between interventions." Whitcomb waved a gloved hand. "A minor adjustment period. All patients experience temporary adaptation. It is a sign that the mind is yielding, that the storm has been stilled." Bellwether shook his head. "Stilled? Yes, but at what cost? Are we certain that our language, our phrasing, does not exaggerate calm while masking? Absence?" Whitcomb smiled, faintly, patiently. "Absence is not the same as harm. The mind is a landscape, Mr. Bellwether, and we are merely pruning where disorder threatens to overwhelm the orderly gardens of reason. The city demands serenity, not contemplation of complexity. Families do not seek philosophical nuance. They seek compliance, peace, quiet." The attendant shifted again, glancing toward the door as though expecting the walls themselves to rise in protest. "And if they realize what has been lost?" he asked softly. "If families notice that their loved ones do not recall, do not dream, do not respond as before?" Whitcomb's smile sharpened, polite yet unyielding. "Then we remind them, progress is rarely gentle. Civilization itself demands compromise. The patients remain alive. Their agitation is quelled. They exist within the world, and that is the measure we must offer the public." Bellwether sighed, leaning heavily against the wall. "And the nurses? The doctors? Some are uneasy. Herrick, for one, questions the procedure's morality." Whitcomb's expression remained serene. "Herrick fears what he cannot control. That is natural in a man of conscience, but it is irrelevant to the task at hand. Our duty is to maintain order within the ward, within the mind, within the perception of London itself. Anything else is secondary." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Only the gas lamp hummed, the soft flutter of wax against its flame. Outside, the night pressed against the asylum windows, fog curling around the eaves like unseen fingers, and somewhere in the distance, London exhaled in anticipation of its next rumour, its next worry, its next fascination. Whitcomb tapped the table lightly. "Very well. Let the nurses continue observations, maintain the ward, and reassure families. We will draft new pamphlets for the curious. And above all, no mention of unintended consequences. That is the lesson we offer the city. Calm, prosperity, obedience. Bellwether nodded reluctantly. The attendants, silent and uneasy, exchanged glances. And in the ward above, the patients lay in perfect stillness, unaware that their silence had become a ledger of secrets, one that would never leave the back room. The meeting adjourned quietly. The lamp flickered, the night deepened, and the asylum waited, still and untroubled, for the city to accept the illusion of order, never knowing the cost that lay beneath. In the dim archives beneath the asylum, a row of casebooks stood upon oak shelves polished by decades of careful dusting. Each volume, bound in dark leather with gilt lettering, contained meticulously recorded observations of the patients who had passed through the neurocorrective wing. Their lives, once vivid and uncontainable, had been reduced to measurements of compliance, notes on emotional stabilization, and scores on behavior charts designed to reassure families and city officials alike. Dr. Alistair Herrick stood before the shelves, fingertips brushing over the spines as though he could feel the pulse of every life contained within. The air smelled faintly of old paper, wax polish, and the lingering sweetness of ether, the ghosts of countless procedures. He pulled down the first volume and opened it carefully. The pages yellowed, the ink smudged in places from hurried hands and nervous nights. Eleanor Grace's name appeared first. Her entry detailed her trembling hands, her agitation, the precise dosages of ether administered, and the notes of her subsequent behavior. Patient displays complete compliance, the record stated. No outbursts observed. Speech coherent, though effect diminished. Herrick read the words aloud softly, though no one could hear him. Diminished. The word echoed in his mind, hollow and accusing. The next entry was Clarissa Hale. Her vibrant defiance had been meticulously catalogued before the procedure, each act of independence recorded with clinical precision. After the operation, the notes shifted. Patient responds only to prompts, volition reduced, no spontaneous verbalizations. The page smelled faintly of ink and decay. Herrick traced the words with his fingertip, as if by touch he could restore the spark that had been removed. Jacob Merton's page followed. Observations noted the cessation of dreams, the absence of curiosity, the blankness of expression. Timothy Cleves, Nathaniel Ashcombe, Mrs. Penelope Hargrave's late husband, they were all here, their lives condensed to charts, tables, and detached commentary. The pattern was unmistakable. Every patient had been rendered obedient, compliant, muted, yet at the expense of the very essence of self. Herrick's chest tightened as he closed the casebook. He thought of Nurse Dawes, who had witnessed these changes firsthand, who had noted them quietly in her own journals, yet whose observations were often dismissed. He thought of the families, blissfully ignorant, who praised the return of calm without realizing the cost. And he thought of the city, eager for silence, for order, for the illusion that the human spirit could be managed like a ledger. He ran his hands along the shelf, considering the rows of volumes. Each one was a monument to success in the eyes of Whitcomb and Bellwether, a testament to the power of medicine to impose obedience. But to Herrick they were tombstones. Lives once rich with memory, imagination, rebellion, laughter, and sorrow had been reduced to sterile notation. Names remained, but personalities were lost. The ledger measured conformity, not life. Herrick opened another volume at random and saw Anne Carraway's name. The page was carefully annotated: procedure duration, ether dosage, observed behaviors. A faint tear smeared the ink where a nurse's hand had pressed too hard. He traced the smear and imagined the panic she must have felt during the demonstration. Her terror, her fleeting resistance, erased in the calm that followed. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows of the shelves lengthening in the flickering lamplight. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like distant whispers, carrying with it the muffled noises of the sleeping city. Herrick closed the volume and exhaled slowly. The casebooks were a record of progress. The casebooks were a record of obedience. The casebooks were a record of souls subdued. And yet, despite their clinical precision, despite their neat charts and carefully measured observations, Herrick could not reconcile the ledger with life. He knew that behind every line, every note, every successful procedure, something had been taken. Something fundamental. In the dim silence of the archives, he whispered to himself, a confession to the empty room. They are not cured, they are lost. And the volumes on the shelves seemed to agree, their leathered spines pressing inward, as if bearing the weight of every erased spark that had once made a patient human. Miss Evelyn Fairchild had been a child of laughter once, the kind whose giggles echoed through the parlours of her genteel home in South Kensington. Her eyes had sparkled with curiosity, her fingers had traced patterns in the dust of the hearth, and her small voice had carried through corridors with the insistent joy of untempered life. But by the time she arrived at the neurocorrective wing, that laughter had become dangerous in the eyes of her family. Her father, a strict man of commerce and order, had grown weary of the occasional outburst, the sudden sobs that disrupted dinner, the trembling hands that betrayed anxiety he could neither soothe nor tolerate. The leaflets promising calm, gentle operation for emotional relief, a humane method for restoring order, arrived in the post like an invitation to salvation. And so Evelyn Fairchild was brought to the asylum, bright-eyed and trembling, unaware that her humanity would be redefined by instruments and ether. On the morning of her operation, Nurse Beatrice Dawes accompanied her to the preparation room. Evelyn's small hands clutched the edges of the stretcher, as if she feared letting go might dissolve her into the ether itself. The cone was adjusted above her face, releasing the fragrant sweetness that dulled fear and flattened thought alike. Her lashes drooped as the world softened into indistinct shapes. Dr. Whitcomb's hands, precise and deliberate, adjusted the slender surgical tool above the delicate orbital bone. The first tap of the mallet was courteous, almost tender, yet the impact travelled far beyond the instrument's tip. It reverberated through Evelyn's skull and through the chamber itself, a subtle but absolute declaration that her mind was no longer her own. When she awoke, she was calm, terribly calm. Her family, standing at the foot of her bed, marvelled at the change. The tremors were gone, the sobs had ceased, her posture was perfect. Her eyes, glassy and placid, reflected no turmoil. "Evelyn, darling, do you feel better?" her mother asked softly, trying to summon the gleam of life she remembered in her daughter. Evelyn turned her head slowly, lips parting in a careful imitation of politeness. "Yes," she whispered. Her mother stepped closer, searching for a spark in her gaze. "And the tears, dear? Do they come still?" Evelyn's eyes remained unmoistened. No quiver, no release. She shook her head once, softly. "No." Her father exhaled, satisfied. "See, Clara? Order has returned." But Nurse Dawes, standing near the doorway, could see the absence behind the compliance. Evelyn's body was alive, her voice was gentle. But the life that had leapt, cried, laughed, and questioned, all that vibrancy was gone, replaced by stillness, obedience, and the terrifying serenity of a soul muted. In the following days, the ward adjusted to Evelyn's new quiet. She walked the corridors without complaint, her small hands folded as if in constant prayer, her eyes reflecting nothing of the world's chaos or beauty. Other children, newly admitted, glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, sensing instinctively that she had passed through something profound. Nurse Dawes often lingered beside her during evening rounds, brushing stray hair from her forehead, murmuring soft words of reassurance. Evelyn's lips moved in response, polite, compliant, but she did not cry. She did not laugh. She did not dream. The city outside, eager for calm, would never know that this child's stillness was not peace. Families were satisfied. Physicians celebrated the result. The ward remained orderly. And yet, in the quiet moments when only ether and gaslight spoke, it was clear that something essential had been lost forever. The capacity to feel, to release, to live fully. Evelyn Fairchild had been cured of agitation, but in doing so, she had been cured of herself. And in that silent triumph, Victorian medicine celebrated its most chilling victory yet. It began with a tremor, a subtle ripple through the ward that no one could initially explain. A chair tipped, a patient's hand brushed against the linen of another bed. The air, normally perfumed with antiseptic and the faint sweetness of lingering ether, suddenly seemed heavy with anticipation. The stillness that had dominated the neurocorrective wing for weeks began to fracture, as though the quiet obedience imposed upon the patients could no longer contain itself. The first to act was young Timothy Cleves. He rose from his chair without instruction, small feet tapping sharply against the tile floor. His head darted from side to side, eyes wide, alert. Nurse Dawes, patrolling the ward, moved toward him instinctively, her heart thudding with an unease she could scarcely name. "Timothy, sit!" she whispered, voice trembling. He did not obey. Within moments, others followed. Jacob Merton kicked off his blankets and began pacing, the motion mechanical yet urgent, as though a river long dammed had finally breached its banks. Clarissa Hale, though still silent, pushed her chair backward, glancing around the room with a precision that betrayed awareness. Even Miss Evelyn Fairchild, whose lips had not once parted in spontaneous speech, pressed her small hands against the railing and shuffled forward, her gaze darting to every corner of the ward. The attendants moved quickly to restrain the surge, but the momentum of unrest was too strong. Chairs tipped, instruments clattered against the floor, and the soft, controlled hum of the ward was shattered by a chorus of shuffling feet and panicked gasps. For the first time in weeks, the patient's energy was raw, unfiltered, impossible to manage with the veneer of calm so carefully maintained. Dr. Whitcomb appeared in the doorway, his expression an unnerving mixture of authority and disbelief. "Control them," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. But his order, so often sufficient to calm the obedient, fell on ears no longer conditioned for compliance. The patients moved with a restless intelligence. He had not anticipated patterns of behavior that suggested memory, initiative, and perhaps even defiance. Herrick, arriving moments later, froze at the threshold. The ward was no longer a cathedral of obedience. It was a storm confined within four walls, the remnants of individuality clawing its way to the surface. His stomach churned as he watched Jacob Merton kick against the rails, Timothy dart between beds, and Clarissa maintain a silent, calculating awareness that unsettled even the most experienced nurses. Outside the ward, the commotion drew the attention of Bellwether. He arrived, cane tapping sharply against the tiles, exhaling in indignation. "What is this disorder?" he demanded, eyes narrowing. Whitcomb gestured helplessly toward the fray. "An anomaly," he said tightly. "Perhaps a result of overstimulation. We must reassert control." Bellwether's fingers clenched around the cane. "Control," he repeated. "These patients have been obedient for weeks. What has caused this?" Herrick shook his head. "They remember something," he muttered, voice low. "Or perhaps they never forgot completely. Something within them is resisting the stillness imposed upon them." Nurse Dawes moved to assist the attendants, guiding the frightened yet purposeful patients toward their beds. Yet each time a hand was grasped, another slipped free. The ward, long regarded as a triumph of calm, had become a theatre of subtle rebellion. The quiet compliance had fractured, revealing the fragile humanity beneath. After nearly an hour, the riot subsided. The patients were returned to their beds, guided with gentle hands, coaxed into positions of apparent obedience. The gas lamps flickered, casting elongated shadows across the tile floor, their light trembling as though afraid to illuminate the aftermath. Whitcomb and Bellwether exchanged grim, silent looks. Both knew that this night would linger in memory, proof that the mind, however subdued, was never fully tamed. Nurse Dawes, standing beside Herrick in the shadowed corner of the ward, whispered, "They are still themselves, beneath it all." Herrick's jaw tightened. "And that," he said, voice low, "is what makes them dangerous, and remarkable, and alive." The asylum had imposed obedience. It had demanded silence. But in the faint, flickering hours of that night, individuality had surfaced, and the ward had finally, terrifyingly, reminded them all that the human spirit cannot be completely subdued. In a dimly lit corner of the asylum, where the air carried the faint perfume of ether and polished wood, a photographer had set up his equipment. It was an unusual addition to the neurocorrective wing, one justified to the board as a method of scientific documentation, a visual ledger of the procedure's efficacy. Yet the camera, with its large brass lens and bellows that expanded and contracted like a living thing, captured more than compliance. It captured something that no ledger, no chart, no neatly phrased case note could convey: the essence of what had been lost. Miss Eleanor Grace was the first subject that day. She sat upright in a wooden chair, hands folded neatly on her lap. Her hair, brushed meticulously by Nurse Dawes, framed her pale face. The gas lamps illuminated her features, casting soft shadows that seemed almost reverent in their stillness. Whitcomb had instructed her to remain calm, as if posing for a portrait. The photographer, a quiet man named Mr. Thorne, adjusted the camera's lens and focused the image. "Hold perfectly still," he instructed gently, his voice carrying through the soft hush of the room. "Do not move. Breathe naturally." Eleanor's lips parted faintly, echoing the instructions with a soundless grace. She obeyed. Her eyes, once vibrant, now held only the faintest glimmer of awareness, like sunlight reflected from a distant, unreachable surface. Thorne clicked the shutter. The mechanism's sound, a soft, metallic sigh, echoed faintly. In that instant, the photograph captured more than a calm patient. It captured the emptiness beneath the surface, the delicate, nearly invisible absence of curiosity, of thought, of life unrestrained. Next, Jacob Merton was positioned. He sat in a similar chair, hands folded, eyes wide yet glassy. The photographer instructed him to look straight ahead, and Jacob obeyed, mechanically, without comprehension. His dreams, his impulsive joy, his curiosity, those qualities that had once defined him, were absent. The camera froze him in this imposed serenity. Timothy Cleves, though smaller, required the same gentle guidance. The young boy's hands rested in his lap, his feet unmoving. His gaze followed the lens only to the extent required, blank yet obedient. Whitcomb whispered encouragements. "See, he is peaceful, he is calm." Order restored. Clarissa Hale posed last. She had been spirited once, defiant, even in the face of authority. Now she lifted her head slowly and allowed herself to be positioned. Her lips curved faintly into a polite approximation of a smile. Her eyes, though open, betrayed nothing. Mr. Thorne focused carefully. The photograph recorded her exact stillness, her measured obedience, her haunting absence of self. After the session, the photographs were developed and displayed for the board. Each image was accompanied by case notes, neat columns listing dosage, procedure time, and patient response. To the board, the portraits testified to the success of Whitcomb's methods: calm, obedient, manageable. Families would see these images and be reassured. The city would read the reports and celebrate the triumph of Victorian medicine. Yet Herrick and Dawes saw differently. They lingered over the portraits, noticing the subtleties, the slight flattening of expressions, the absence of spark in the eyes, the way the body held itself in a precise, unnatural posture. The photographs, though celebrated as evidence of progress, bore witness to a deeper truth. The patients were alive in body but diminished in spirit, captured in frames that would forever hide what had been stolen. Nurse Dawes whispered softly to Herrick, "They look obedient, but empty." Herrick's gaze did not waver. Yes, perfectly obedient, and perfectly lost. The board clapped politely, entirely unaware of the subtle horror contained in each carefully posed, perfectly lit image. The photographs promised proof of mastery, but to those who had seen the patients before and after, they revealed only what medicine had erased: the flicker of selfhood, the light of dreams, the essence of life itself. And in the dim, ether-laden room, the photographs waited quietly, immortalizing obedience and the tragic cost of calm. The long night arrived like a heavy fog, pressing against the asylum's brick walls, seeping through cracks, curling into corners where no light dared to linger. Inside the neurocorrective wing, the patients lay or sat in their ordered positions, obedient, calm, dreamless, their breaths steady and shallow. The ward hummed with the faint, measured rhythm of artificial peace. But outside the walls, a different storm was gathering, one that weighed upon those entrusted with the care, control, and concealment of this newly manufactured serenity. Dr. Alistair Herrick sat alone in the small office that overlooked the ward, a ledger open before him, quill idle in his hand. He had spent the day observing, recording, and counting. Names, dosages, outcomes, behaviors, all meticulously documented. Yet no measure could capture the emptiness that pressed upon the room, nor the hollow light behind the eyes of those who had been rendered compliant. He thought of Eleanor Grace, once so vivid, now so muted, of Clarissa Hale, whose defiance had been replaced by polite stillness, of Jacob Merton, whose dreams had vanished. Even young Timothy Cleves, spirited and defiant before the ether, sat like a small automaton, eyes tracking only what was expected of him. Each patient was accounted for, each procedure a triumph in the ledger, each observation a testament to Victorian order. And yet, each life seemed subtly, irrevocably diminished. The door creaked open. Nurse Beatrice Dawes stepped inside, her face pale, eyes reflecting the faint lamplight like glass. "Doctor," she whispered, "it is still, too still." Herrick did not lift his head. "I have watched them all day," he murmured, "and I cannot reconcile what I see with the records we submit. They are obedient, yes, calm, yes, but they are hollow." Dawes drew closer, hands trembling. "It is as if the procedure takes more than agitation. It takes essence, what they were, what made them alive." Herrick closed the ledger slowly. The scratch of the quill on paper seemed louder in the quiet. "I record data," he said softly. "I note absence of outbursts, compliance with instructions, reduction in distress. But that is not life. It is mimicry, an imitation of normalcy." Outside the window, the fog pressed tight against the glass, bending the gas lamps into pale orbs, blurring the courtyard. The night itself seemed to watch, silent and unblinking. Dawes knelt beside Herrick, lowering her voice further. If the city knew, if the families knew, would they understand? Or would they be satisfied that the trembling has stopped? Herrick shook his head, a shiver of despair running through him. They would see only calm, they would praise the procedure, they would herald our success. And yet, his hands, trembling despite years of surgical precision, rested upon the ledger. "And yet we have exchanged obedience for soul." The silence stretched. From the ward below, the soft, uniform rhythm of breathing filled the air, an eerie accompaniment to their contemplation. They could hear the faint shuffle of a foot, the gentle sigh of a patient's exhalation, yet there was no laughter, no murmur of thought, no small rebellion in the night, only stillness. "Tonight," Dawes whispered, "I cannot sleep. I keep imagining them. Before the procedure. And now—" Her voice trailed off, swallowed by the thick air. Herrick rose slowly, pacing near the window. He stared into the fog-drenched courtyard, seeing it not as a path to freedom, but as a boundary enclosing the consequences of their work. "We must continue," he said finally, voice hollow. "We are bound by duty, by procedure, by the promises we have made." Dawes pressed her hand to the ledger. "But at what cost, Doctor? At what cost?" Herrick did not answer. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the courtyard in its grey embrace. The gas lamps glimmered faintly, casting long shadows into the asylum's hallways. Inside, the ward remained still, obedient, dreamless, alive only in body. And as the night deepened, Herrick and Dawes sat in shared silence, the weight of the day pressing upon them like a stone, each haunted by the understanding that the calm they had imposed would outlast the conscience of those who had wrought it. In the long night of reconsideration, the ward slept, and the city remained ignorant, eager for tranquility, unaware of the souls that had been quietly subdued to satisfy its desire for peace. In hushed parlours and behind the veiled windows of London townhouses, the whispers began to circulate. It started as a murmur, drifting from the drawing rooms of anxious mothers, the corridors of concerned fathers, and the discreet gatherings of servants who had witnessed the change before the ledger recorded it. Families who had once praised the neurocorrective wing for restoring calm now hesitated, their words slow, careful, as though speaking too loudly might summon consequences they could not name. And the term that emerged, barely breathed at first, carried with it a weight that no ledger, pamphlet, or polite reassurance could contain: soul theft. Mrs. Penelope Hargrave was the first to articulate it clearly, in the quiet despair of her private parlour. She had visited the ward repeatedly, observing the vacant obedience of her late husband, his eyes calm, compliant, yet utterly devoid of recognition. The man who returned to her side bore the body of Nathaniel Hargrave, but the spark that had once defined him, the laughter, the private jokes, the small, irreplaceable idiosyncrasies of his soul, had been severed. "They have taken him from me," she whispered to her maid, whose eyes glistened with shared understanding. "They have given me a body, but no husband. They have stolen him." From there, the phrase spread quietly but irresistibly. It surfaced in letters sent to distant relatives, in the cautious inquiries of parish priests who had been called to comfort grieving families, and even in the shadowed alcoves of clubs where gentlemen discussed propriety and the order of society. Each time the phrase passed from one mouth to another, it gained weight, like a whispered secret accumulating substance, until it was nearly tangible. In the asylum itself, the word was never spoken aloud, yet the staff began to sense its presence. Nurse Beatrice Dawes, who had long observed the subtle distortions wrought by ether and steel, felt it in the silence that stretched across the neurocorrective wing. Each patient, calm and compliant, seemed to exude the echo of what had been taken, and Dawes could not dismiss the sensation that they were, in a sense, aware of their loss, even if they no longer possessed the faculties to articulate it. Dr. Herrick, too, began to hear the term in conversations that skirted his professional ear. A visiting physician, seated discreetly in the observation gallery, had muttered the words as he studied a row of vacant faces. "Soul theft," he said under his breath, shaking his head as though to rid himself of the discomfort it stirred. Herrick had nodded grimly, understanding the term better than any polite society might. These were lives rendered compliant, individuality stripped with precision, a veneer of calm imposed at the expense of essence. Even Dr. Whitcomb, who prided himself on the meticulous language of medical authority, noticed the term's creeping influence. Though he dismissed it publicly, internally it gnawed at him. It had a clarity that clinical descriptions could not match. Patients were not merely improved, they were hollowed, a quiet, exacting theft that the ledger could never fully describe. Outside the asylum, the whispers began to influence perception. Families grew uneasy despite reassurances. Patrons questioned the ethics behind the procedures. Editors considered the delicate balance of publishing praise and acknowledging subtle horror. London, city of fog and gaslight, began to wonder, quietly, carefully, behind closed doors, if the calm imposed upon its most vulnerable citizens had come at a cost too dear to measure. And in the ward, as the gas lamps flickered over beds perfectly aligned, the patients breathed in obedient silence. Their compliance was complete. Their essence, measured in the ledger and captured in photographs, had been methodically subdued. The city had demanded calm. The asylum had delivered obedience. And in the hushed parlours, in whispered letters, in the quiet corners of London society, the term soul theft travelled like a chill wind, hinting at the cost no ledger would record and no physician would admit aloud. The final surgery was scheduled for the first grey light of a February morning, when the fog still pressed heavily against the asylum windows and the gas lamps flickered with tentative resolve. Dr. Whitcomb prepared with his usual precision, laying out instruments polished to a mirror sheen, arranging linens with careful geometry, and calibrating the ether dosage as though orchestrating a symphony of control. The ward was hushed, obedient, waiting in silence as if it too understood the gravity of the act about to unfold. The patient was a young woman named Helena Marwood, admitted after a series of violent emotional outbursts had rendered her family desperate. She was thin, pale, and trembled faintly, as if she sensed the fate that had already befallen so many before her. Nurse Beatrice Dawes adjusted her pillows and whispered reassurances, though each word trembled in the cold, perfumed air. Dr. Alistair Herrick lingered nearby, a shadow at the edge of the theatre, hands trembling despite years of experience. He had performed countless observations, yet every procedure left him hollow with unease. He had seen the vacant obedience, the muted curiosity, the dreamless eyes of those who had undergone the same intervention. He could not deny what he had witnessed. Each patient, compliant and calm, bore the subtle, indelible mark of absence. Whitcomb entered, serene as ever, gloved hands clasped. "Today," he said softly, "we shall conclude our work in the most illustrative manner. Observe carefully and understand the efficacy of our methods. Our duty is to restore order, and we shall do so once more." The ether cone was placed over Helena's face. The sweet, intoxicating scent filled the theatre, curling into every corner and softening the edges of consciousness. Her breath slowed, shallow and even, and her trembling hands fell to her lap. Herrick watched with a growing sense of dread as the familiar transformation began, a calm settling over the body, obedience taking the place of fear, compliance the place of defiance. Whitcomb lifted the slender surgical instrument, positioning it with the precision of a watchmaker. He tapped gently with the mallet, the sound echoing faintly through the room like a soft bell tolling in a cathedral of silence. The first incision was swift, the separation subtle yet absolute. Helena's eyelids fluttered once, a faint resistance, and then she was still. Her breathing remained even, her hands rested obediently in her lap, her face serene in a way that betrayed no hint of the inner turmoil that had once made her human. Herrick exhaled slowly, pressing his palm to his forehead. The familiar emptiness pressed against him, the uncanny calm, the absence of thought, the silencing of the self. He understood fully now that the procedure did not merely quiet the mind. It extracted the essence of individuality, leaving compliance in its place. Nurse Dawes adjusted the blankets and checked the restraints, noting the perfect stillness of Helena's body. She whispered softly, as if to convince herself, "She is calm, she is safe." Yet she could not disguise the unease that tightened her chest. The silence of the ward was no longer comforting, it was oppressive, a reminder of what had been stolen from so many. Whitcomb stepped back, surveying his work. "Another success," he murmured, serene, satisfied. To the board, to the families, to London society, it would be considered exemplary. The procedure had restored order, removed agitation, and created the illusion of peace. But Herrick and Dawes saw it differently. They saw obedience imposed at the cost of individuality, compliance purchased through the erasure of thought, and calm achieved through the quiet theft of the soul. Outside, fog pressed against the asylum windows, curling and twisting like unseen fingers, as if the city itself shivered in recognition of what had been done. Inside, the ward remained still, obedient, dreamless, a testament to Victorian medicine's final triumph. And in the quiet, Herrick understood the immutable truth. The final surgery was not a cure. It was a conclusion, a perfectly executed, irrevocable erasure of self. The decision to close the neurocorrective wing came quietly, without announcement, without fanfare. And yet, the air seemed to thrum with the weight of inevitability. Superintendent Bellwether had insisted on the closure, citing the increasing scrutiny of families, the murmurs in the press, and the subtle disquiet of the staff. To the city, it was a prudent measure, an administrative adjustment, a responsible measure of governance. To those who had worked within its walls, it was an ending of a far darker magnitude. Nurse Beatrice Dawes walked the hallways for the final time, her footsteps measured, the soft tap of her slippers against the polished tile echoing faintly. Each bed was empty of its former inhabitant or prepared for transfer to other wings. Linens were folded with careful precision, instruments returned to locked cabinets, charts bundled for archival. The familiar scent of ether lingered, faint yet stubborn, a ghostly reminder of the countless minds that had passed through here, transformed, subdued, silenced. Dr. Alistair Herrick followed behind her, shoulders hunched, eyes drawn to the rows of still beds. Each mattress had once held a human being, vibrant with tremors, dreams, defiance, and thought. Now they were either empty, awaiting transfer, or occupied by those whose minds had been methodically flattened to a perfection of obedience. He could not look at them without feeling the chill of a loss that no ledger, no photograph, no record could ever fully capture. The patients themselves, those still present, sat obediently or lay quietly, their bodies and faces masks of compliance. They did not question the closure, did not express curiosity, did not resist. The ward had been their world, and its sudden decommissioning, though executed with care, meant little to those whose inner lives had been muted. Bellwether arrived, walking briskly, cane tapping rhythmically against the floor. He inspected the hallways, noting the neat alignment of beds, the polished floors, the orderly stacks of charts. "Everything is in accordance," he remarked. "This wing has served its purpose. We close it now to consolidate operations and ensure oversight is maintained." Whitcomb followed, gloved hands clasped behind his back, expression serene. He surveyed the ward with the satisfaction of a man who had achieved a difficult and precise objective. "Our work here has been exemplary," he said. "The procedures have restored calm. Families may rest assured that their loved ones are now manageable, stable, and compliant." Herrick could not respond. Words failed him. He felt the weight of all the lives altered, the dreams erased, the personalities subdued, pressing into his chest like a stone. Nurse Dawes moved to adjust a patient's pillow, noting the perfect stillness, the obedience ingrained through the long, quiet weeks of treatment. She knew she would carry the memory of each patient for the rest of her life, a ledger of sorrow invisible to the city outside. The doors to the ward were locked one final time, the brass latch turning with a soft click that echoed ominously through the empty corridors. The lamps were extinguished, leaving the room in shadow, the faint residual scent of ether clinging to the walls like a memory. Outside, fog curled along the eaves, heavy and grey, swallowing the asylum in its silence. Within, the stillness was absolute. The ward had ceased to function, but the evidence of its work remained in the eyes and bodies of those who had been altered, in the archived charts, in the photographs that would be shown to patrons and families as proof of success. Herrick and Dawes lingered, observing the shadows one last time. The city beyond demanded calm. The ward had delivered it, perfectly and irrevocably. And yet, both knew that calm had come at a cost too terrible to measure. The doors were finally bolted, the wing was closed, and in the lingering scent of ether, in the silent beds, and in the muted eyes of the patients, the human spirit, subdued but unbroken, bore witness to what Victorian medicine had wrought. Beneath the asylum, down a narrow staircase that creaked faintly under each careful step, lay the archive. It was a place rarely visited, accessible only to a select few physicians tasked with record-keeping, clerks responsible for administrative continuity, and the occasional auditor summoned by the board. The air was dense with the scent of old paper, faint ether lingering like a ghost of long-forgotten procedures, and the persistent musk of polished oak. In this subterranean sanctuary of documentation lay the full weight of the asylum's triumphs and its quiet, unspoken tragedies. Dr. Alistair Herrick entered first, lantern in hand, the soft glow illuminating the rows of shelves that reached toward the vaulted ceiling. Each shelf held bound volumes, meticulously labeled in gilt lettering, and within them, the lives of the patients who had passed through the neurocorrective wing. He ran his fingers along the spines as though seeking warmth in the leather, a connection to those whose minds had been subdued with precision and whose souls had been silently diminished. Nurse Beatrice Dawes followed, carrying a bundle of charts that had been recently filed. Her steps were tentative, reverent, as though she feared disturbing the contents of the archive with mere presence. "It smells of ether even down here," she whispered, voice barely audible over the hush of the stone corridors. "It clings to the pages, the bindings, almost as if it remembers." Herrick nodded, opening the first volume on the nearest shelf. The pages were yellowed and carefully inked, each patient's name recorded with precise attention to dosage, response, and compliance. Eleanor Grace, Clarissa Hale, Jacob Merton, Timothy Cleves, Nathaniel Ashcombe, each had an entry, each meticulously annotated. The data was clinical, detached, celebrating obedience, the absence of outbursts, the restoration of order. Yet to Herrick, each page screamed a different truth: the absence of thought, the loss of dreams, the hollowed quiet that followed. Dawes gently placed the charts she carried upon the table, glancing at the open volume. "Do you think anyone outside these walls would understand?" she asked softly. "The families, the board, the city." Herrick shook his head. "They will see only what we allow them to see. Compliance, calm, success. The ledger never records absence, only outcomes. The ledger cannot capture the soul." He turned the pages, lingering on photographs affixed alongside some entries: polite, posed images of patients sitting obediently in chairs, eyes vacant yet composed, hands folded as instructed. To an observer, the photographs suggested tranquility. To Herrick and Dawes, they were haunting evidence of lives diminished. "The board will be pleased," Dawes murmured bitterly. "They see order, they see control, they see results." Herrick's hand lingered on a photograph of Clarissa Hale. The woman's eyes, once defiant, now stared blankly, lips curved faintly in polite approximation of a smile. "Yes," he said, voice low, tremulous. they see results. But the cost is here. In every page, every image, every patient whose life has been softened into obedience, a ledger of loss, an archive of regret. Dawes lowered her gaze, tracing the bindings with her fingertips. "We can't undo it," she whispered. "We cannot return what has been taken." Herrick closed the volume slowly, the soft snap of leather echoing through the quiet archive. "No," he admitted. "And that is the horror of it. Every triumph is inseparable from its cost. Every orderly patient is a reminder of what we have erased." Outside, the wind pressed against the asylum walls, curling through the eaves like a whisper. Inside, the lanterns glimmered over the rows of casebooks, the meticulous records, the photographs that would testify to success. And in that subterranean hall, Herrick and Dawes understood the full measure of their labor. Calm had been achieved, obedience enforced, tranquility imposed. But in the quiet of the archive, in the stillness of the leather-bound pages, and in the lingering scent of ether, the undeniable truth remained. The asylum had claimed more than compliance. It had claimed their humanity, and the ledger would bear witness forever. Though it was never uttered aloud in the polished corridors of the neurocorrective wing, the term had begun to haunt those who observed its consequences closely. Soul theft. It floated between whispered confidences, carried on the half-breathed complaints of families, and lingered in the corners of parlors where mothers and fathers huddled over tea. It was a phrase as delicate as it was damning, and yet it encapsulated a truth that no ledger could fully record. Mrs. Penelope Hargrave was the first to give voice to it. She had paced the length of her drawing room for hours, hands trembling over the hem of her silk gown, staring into the fireplace where the last embers glowed weakly. Her late husband had returned to her from the neurocorrective wing, calm, compliant, and orderly, yet she recognized immediately that the man before her was no longer the one she had loved. His eyes, though open, carried no spark of memory, no trace of the subtle humor that had once lived there. "They have taken him," she whispered to the maid, who dared not speak louder, lest the walls themselves carry the accusation. "They have given me a body, but no husband. They have stolen him." The phrase traveled slowly at first, surfacing in letters to distant relatives, in private conversations with parish priests, in hushed remarks among physicians who dared not challenge Whitcomb or Bellwether openly. In drawing rooms across London, it was spoken carefully, almost reverently, as if naming it might invoke the very act itself. Families who had once praised the ward for restoring calm now recoiled, recognizing the cost behind the veneer of obedience. Within the asylum, the staff felt its weight as a persistent undercurrent. Nurse Beatrice Dawes, who had long observed the subtle distortions wrought by ether and instrument, recognized it immediately. It hovered in the long, silent gazes of the patients, the still, obedient forms whose breaths rose and fell in uniform rhythm. Though they could not articulate the term, it was as if the patients themselves bore witness to what had been taken. Dr. Alistair Herrick, already haunted by the consequences of the procedures, understood the phrase with uncanny clarity. He had watched Eleanor Grace drift dreamless, Clarissa Hale mute, Jacob Merton empty of imagination, and Nathaniel Ashcombe adrift from identity. Soul theft, it was the most precise description he had heard. The patients were alive in body, obedient in action, yet hollow in essence, as though a careful hand had plucked the inner fire and left only a polished shell. Even Dr. Whitcomb, who prided himself on clinical authority and careful language, felt the sting of the term in private. He dismissed it outwardly as idle speculation, but internally it carried a weight that no reassurance, no report, no pamphlet could mitigate. Soul theft hinted at something precise, undeniable, and damning an act that the instruments performed with mechanical precision, but no moral guidance. Outside the asylum, The phrase spread quietly through the city. Mothers spoke of it in hushed tones to governesses. Fathers discussed it behind closed doors with solicitors, and parish priests offered cautious commentary to attentive congregations. London, a city that had clamoured for calm, began to sense the cost of the order imposed upon its most vulnerable citizens. Inside the ward, the patients remained still. Gas lamps cast elongated shadows across beds polished and aligned with meticulous care. The silence was perfect, obedient, dreamless. Yet in that quiet, Nurse Dawes and Herrick both knew that it was not peace, it was an absence, a theft. And the term lingered like a phantom, moving from whispered conversation to private acknowledgement, until it became unavoidable. The patients had been subdued, their minds quieted, their obedience purchased at the expense of the very essence of their being. London had wanted tranquility. The asylum had delivered obedience. And in the whispered term soul theft, the city was slowly beginning to understand the cost. By the final days of February, the neurocorrective wing had been shuttered, its doors bolted, its lamps extinguished, leaving the ward in a quiet that was absolute. The city outside pressed against the asylum walls with its usual fog and frost, oblivious to the human cost contained within. Inside, the echoes of past procedures lingered in the stale air, scented faintly with ether and polished wood, like the memory of a perfume long worn and never forgotten. Nurse Beatrice Dawes walked the empty corridors, footsteps slow, deliberate, each tap against the tile a reminder of the lives once contained here. Beds were stripped of linens or stacked neatly in the corner, instruments polished and stored away, charts bundled in leather folders for the archives. Yet the memory of the patients, their vacant obedience, their dreamless compliance, their stolen individuality pressed upon her as tangibly as the fog pressing against the windows. Dr. Alistair Herrick lingered near the final row of beds, now empty. He traced the outlines of the mattresses with his eyes, recalling the faces of Eleanor Grace, Clarissa Hale, Jacob Merton, Timothy Cleves, Nathaniel Ashcombe, and so many others. Each had entered the ward alive in spirit, vibrant, unique, and each had departed or remained altered, their wills softened, their curiosity dimmed, their essence subdued. "It is over," Dawes whispered, though the words felt hollow in the vast, perfumed silence. "The ward is closed. The city believes we have succeeded." Herrick did not reply immediately. He knelt beside an empty bed, imagining the young bodies that had lain there, imagining the ripple of their thoughts, the rise and fall of their ambitions, the quiet joys and sorrows that had once been contained within their minds. He remembered the final procedures, the demonstrations, the observation of obedient faces in photographs that celebrated compliance while hiding absence. "The city applauds," he murmured, voice barely audible. "They believe peace has been restored. But peace is not what we left behind. It is silence, absolute, enforced, permanent." Dawes ran a hand along the polished banister of the stairway, her fingers lingering where patients had once clutched it in fear or anticipation. "They are quiet," she said softly, "but they are gone. Not in body, not in presence, but in soul. The calm we imposed cost them everything we cannot measure." Herrick closed his eyes and imagined the patients walking, talking, laughing, and dreaming once more, as they had before the ether and instruments reshaped their minds. He could see them vividly in memory, yet they would never exist again in that form. Not in the ward, not in the city, not in the world they had once known. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing shadows against the asylum's stone facade. Gas lamps swayed faintly in the dim streetlight, reflecting in puddles frozen with the thin sheen of winter. London awaited new patients, new procedures, new promises of calm and order, but the memory of the neurocorrective wing, though hidden from view, persisted quietly in the minds of the few who had witnessed its cost. Dawes and Herrick stood together in the empty hallways, silent, their shadows stretching long against the walls. The quiet of the ward was not peace. It was a monument to obedience, a testament to the removal of the unpredictable, the uncontainable, the human spark. Herrick finally spoke, voice low and haunted. They asked for tranquility. We delivered it. But the cost remains, and it is more profound than the city will ever know. Dawes nodded, her eyes fixed on the darkened windows. And the silence will remain, she said. Not just in the ward, but in every soul we touched, every life we altered, a silence that no one can reverse. The asylum itself seemed to breathe in agreement. Stone and tile absorbing the weight of lives subdued, of dreams erased, of compliance achieved at the expense of humanity. And as the fog pressed tight against the city beyond, and the gas lamps swung gently in the cold, indifferent night, the ward, now empty, shuttered, and perfect in its order, held one final, undeniable truth. Calm had been enforced. Obedience had been purchased. And the silence that remained would endure far longer than memory, far longer than conscience, far longer than hope.